The New Mexico Territory, winter of 1886. The wind crossing Juniper Crossing was not merely cold. It was a blade. It carried needles of ice that sought the skin, slicing through wool and denim, finding the bone beneath. The snow was not falling in gentle drifts. It was a white, horizontal assault, hard as thrown salt. It gathered in the hollows, burying the mesquite, piling against the weak walls of the town's few structures. A thick fog, tasting of iron and ice, pressed down, swallowing the world, erasing the faint track that led toward the Red Sage Basin. Colter Reyes felt the ice collecting in his beard. He pulled the collar of his canvas duster tighter. He was a man who preferred the company of the high rocks and the silent canyons, a loner by choice and by necessity. The world had shrunk to the space between his horse's ears, a gray mare that snorted, plumes of steam billowing from her nostrils, protesting every step through the deepening drifts. He had been checking his trap lines near the frozen creek, a fool's errand in a blizzard that promised to be the worst of the season. He was turning the horse back toward his own cabin, cut deep into the shelter of the basin wall. When he heard it, it was thin, a sound that should not have been there, under the shriek of the wind, a frantic, metallic tink, tink, tink. It was not a cowbell, too high-pitched. It was a goat bell, a lost stray. He paused, listening. The sound was ripped away by the wind, then returned, weaker. It came from the direction of the livery stable, a collapsing structure at the edge of the settlement known more for bad whiskey and desperate men than for sheltering animals. A light, the color of diseased kerosene, leaked from the gaps in the stable's board walls, a weak stain against the suffocating white. Colter turned the mare. The animal sighed, a heavy, weary sound, but obeyed. He nudged her toward the failing light. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the packed snow by the doorway. The horse huddled against the meager shelter of the overhang, knowing better than to move. Colter shoved the heavy, warped door open. The air that hit him was a physical blow, worse than the cold. It was a wave of suffocating heat thick with the stench of uncleaned stalls, stale whiskey, wet wool, and the sour, lingering smell of cheap tobacco. In fear, he could smell that, too. His eyes adjusted to the gloom. In the center of the stable, backed against an empty stall, stood Maida Hollis. He knew of her, the widow, the one who sold bread at the market, rain or shine. She was a woman of substance, not thin and brittle like so many others who had been worn down by the territory. She was broad-shouldered and solid, built to endure winters she had not asked for. Tonight, she looked small. Her wool dress, the color of mud and worn thin at the elbows, was damp. A basket, still half full of dark, unsold loaves, was clutched in one hand like a shield. The man holding her arm was Landon Price, a foreman who managed cattle for an absent owner. Price was a man known for his soft hands and his cruel pleasures. His fingers were dug deep into the sleeve of her dress, twisting the fabric, bruising the flesh beneath. "You've had 3 days, Maida." Price sneered, his voice oily, loud enough to carry over the wind rattling the roof. "The stall rent is due." "The storm," Maida said. Her voice was low, strained, but it did not tremble. "No buyers came. I have nothing." 3 other men were huddled around a crude table near a sputtering stove, a near-empty bottle of whiskey between them. They were the town's refuse, men waiting for the weather to break. This was their evening's entertainment. "Excuses," one of the drunks cackled, slamming his tin cup down. "Pay the man, widow, or find another way to work it off." Price laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. He gave her arm a violent shake. "You hear him. Maida always options." He shoved her. Maida stumbled backward, her hip striking the rough wood of the stall gate. The impact jarred the basket. 2 loaves of bread tumbled out, landing in the soiled straw on the floor. She stared at them, her face pale, but she did not stoop to retrieve them. The drunk who had spoken pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. He walked toward her, weaving slightly, appraising her with a slow, insulting gaze that moved from her boots to her face and back down. "What's the problem? Price," the man slurred, stopping just inches from her. "She's got assets. Just gotta find a buyer, eh?" He laughed, breathing whiskey fumes into her face. "Though it's a hard truth. Widow? No one marries a fat widow?" The stable erupted in braying laughter. The sound bounced off the rafters, sharp and cruel. Maida Hollis closed her eyes for a single second. When she opened them, they were clear. She pressed her lips together so tightly that Coulter, watching from the shadows, saw the line of white around her mouth. She took the insult like a fist to the stomach, absorbing it. Her back, which had been bowed in weariness, straightened, her chin lifted. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She just stood, holding her ground, breathing the foul air, her knuckles white on the handle of her basket. Price, enjoying the spectacle, stepped forward. He pulled a folded paper from his inner coat pocket and snapped it open with theatrical flair. "This ain't about marriage. Boys, this is about debt." He threw the paper at her feet. It landed near the fallen bread. $2 for the market stall, unpaid. He spat. "And this is a writ of seizure, signed all proper by Sheriff Lyle Dorn himself." Maida's gaze dropped to the paper. That, finally, broke her composure. A small, ragged sound tore from her throat, a gasp of pure dread. "That's right," Price said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a confidential, menacing purr. "Dorn agrees. Your debt gives me rights. This ain't about $2 anymore. This is about your collateral." He pointed a dirty finger toward the door. "I'm taking the shack, the land it's on, and the goats." He smiled, including the one running loose in the storm. He was swallowing her whole, taking the roof from her head and the animals that gave her milk. This wasn't a collection. It was an erasure. Coulter Reyes had been standing in the deep shadow by the door for a full minute, a ghost of the storm. He moved. He did not stride. He simply occupied the center of the room, bringing the frozen air with him. The snow on his hat brim began to melt, dripping silently onto the floorboards. The laughter died instantly, cut off as if by a knife. Price spun around, surprised, his hand instinctively dropping from Maida's arm. The drunks at the table froze. Coulter's eyes, the color of wet gunmetal, did not look at Price. They looked at Maida. He saw the faint tremor in her hands. He saw the loaves in the straw. His gaze shifted to the paper on the floor, lingering on the looping signature of Lyle Dorn. "How much for the debt?" Coulter's voice was rough, like stones grinding together in a dry creek bed. Price recovered, puffing out his narrow chest. "This is official business. Reyes, none of your concern. This is between me and the widow." "She owes $2, one of the drunks supplied helpfully, his voice suddenly sober. $2 for the stall." Price snapped, glaring at the man. "But the seizure, the paperwork, the sheriff's time. We'll call it $20. $20 to clear the ledger." An impossible sum, a death sentence. Coulter didn't argue. His gaze remained steady, calculating. He looked from Price to the paper and back to Price. He understood the math. This was theft, wrapped in law. He reached deep inside his duster, past the worn butt of his pistol, and pulled out a heavy leather pouch tied with a rawhide thong. He didn't open it. He weighed it in his hand. "20, Coulter said. He tossed the pouch. It landed on the table with a solid, heavy thud, spilling coins. Silver dollars and half-dollars rolled across the rough wood. It was far more than 20. "That's $40, Coulter said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "For her debt, and for the inconvenience of you gentlemen forgetting this night ever happened." Price's eyes widened. Greed warred with suspicion, and greed won easily. He and the other men lunged for the table, their hands scrambling to gather the silver before Coulter changed his mind. Maida stared at Coulter. She was breathing fast, shallow breaths that fogged in the air. She didn't understand. This was a transaction, and she knew what transactions in dark stables usually meant. She clutched the front of her dress, her free hand rising to her throat. She took a half-step toward him, her whole body trembling. "No one marries a fat widow, sir," she whispered, the words costing her the last of her pride. She was shivering violently now, the shock and the cold meeting in the center of her bones. "I have no way to repay a thing like this." Coulter looked at her. He saw the deep, burning humiliation in her eyes, the dark assumption of what he had just purchased. He stepped past Price, ignoring the man who was now stuffing coins into his pockets. Coulter bent down, with a gloved hand. He picked up the 2 loaves of bread from the straw. He brushed them off, his movements economical and precise, and placed them gently back in her basket. "I'm not buying a person," Coulter said, his voice low and curt, meant only for her. But beneath the gravel, there was a strange, rough warmth. "I'm saving someone who can work." He turned his back to her. He unfastened the heavy clasp of his canvas duster. The thing was lined with thick wool, heavy with the weather, but dry inside. It smelled of pine pitch and horse and the clean scent of the high desert. He swung it off his own shoulders and settled it onto hers. The weight of it almost made her buckle, but it was an anchor. The coat engulfed her, the sleeves hanging past her hands, the hem brushing her ankles. The warmth was immediate, a shock to her frozen skin. He took the basket from her numb fingers. "Let's go." He didn't offer her his arm. He didn't offer comfort. He took charge of her belongings, turned, grabbed the bridle of his mare, and nodded toward the door. Maida Hollis, wrapped in a coat that swallowed her, followed him. As the door opened, letting the storm roar back in, one of the drunks, emboldened by the silver, called out, "Got yourself a hefty blanket for the storm, Reyes." Coulter didn't turn. He didn't pause. He just held the door, shielding Maida from the worst of the wind with his own body as she stepped out into the white hell. He pulled the stable door shut, the thud final, leaving Price and the others to their new wealth and the stale air. The wind screamed. It was no longer just snow. It was a wall of ice particles that cut the skin. Maida staggered as the full force of the blizzard hit her. Coulter's coat was a necessary armor. "Stay behind me," he ordered. It was not a request. He took the lead, his body angled against the gale, breaking the worst of the wind. He led the horse, which protested every step. Its head low, Maida followed, her hands clutching the collar of the heavy coat, her eyes fixed on the dark shape of Coulter's back. The snow was deeper than she'd realized, filling her worn boots, numbing her feet in seconds. They moved away from the yellow light of the livery, which was snuffed out by the fog after only 10 paces. They were alone in the white. The sound of the jeering was gone, replaced by the roar of the high desert winter. He didn't ask her where her shack was. He knew. He also knew it offered no real shelter from a storm this size, not with a roof patched with canvas and hope. He was heading for the high rocks, toward the basin. Their tracks, deep wounds in the snow, disappeared almost as soon as they made them. The wind blew the drifts smooth, erasing their passage, swallowing them whole as they vanished into the red brush and driving ice of the red sage. The cabin was not a cabin. It was a wound in the rock, a space carved deep into the sandstone of the red sage basin, sheltered by a massive overhang that deflected the worst of the elements. Coulter shoved the heavy, axe-hewn plank door open, and the difference was as sudden as a gunshot. The shriek of the blizzard was instantly muffled, cut to a dull, distant moan. Inside, a cast-iron stove, its belly cherry red, radiated a deep, penetrating heat. This was not the suffocating, sour stench of the livery stable. This was the clean, sharp scent of burning piñon pine and dry juniper. The small space was layered in warmth. Maida stumbled past him, half blinded by the sudden shift from white darkness to amber light. The heavy duster, weighted with ice and snow, slid from her shoulders and pooled on the stone floor, a wet, dark circle. Without the coat, she was exposed. She seemed to shrink, though she was not a small woman. She was trembling violently, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that rattled her teeth and made her wrap her arms around her own waist. She gravitated to the stove, huddling on a low wooden bench, her hands stretched toward the iron as if in prayer. She was soaked through. Her worn dress clung to her, and her hair, escaping its pins, was plastered to her forehead. Coulter did not speak. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude. He shut the door, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The sound was final, a heavy thud that shut the world out. He checked his mare, who was thankfully safe in the attached lean-to stable, separated from the main room by a sturdy wall. He returned, stripping off his wet gloves and hat. He took a heavy kettle from a hook and pumped water from an iron cistern pump in the corner, a luxury in the high desert. He set the kettle directly on the stovetop, where it began to hiss almost immediately. Maida watched him, her eyes wide and dark. She was a guest, a prisoner, a refugee. She did not know which. He brought a tin cup, not a delicate thing, but heavy and solid. He dropped a small bundle of dried, grayish leaves into it from a jar on the shelf. "Sage," he said, his first word since the livery. He poured the steaming water over the leaves, and the air filled with a sharp, medicinal scent. "It will stop the shaking." He held the cup out. Maida reached for it, but her hands were trembling too badly. She could not make her fingers close. She pulled them back, ashamed, hiding them in her lap. He set the cup on the bench beside her. "Your hands," he observed. She looked down. They were raw, chapped red from the cold and the lye soap she used. The heel of her right palm was worse. It was smeared with drying blood and dirt, the skin broken. 3 dark, ugly lines were embedded deep in the flesh. "The stall gate," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "When Mr. Price pushed me, it was splintered." Coulter looked at the wound, his expression unreadable. He turned to a wooden shelf, retrieved a small, hinged tin box, and opened it. Inside lay a pair of steel tweezers, a small vial of dark liquid, and a roll of clean cotton stripping. He poured a little of the liquid carbolic acid, by its smell, onto a clean patch of rag. He meticulously wiped the tips of the tweezers. He did not ask her permission. He was not offering aid. He was administering it. He knelt in front of her. He didn't ask for her hand. He simply held his own out, palm up, a silent command. She hesitated. This was an intimacy she had not anticipated. This quiet, rough-looking man kneeling at her feet. Slowly, she uncurled her fingers and placed her injured hand in his. His grip was solid, calloused, the skin like cured leather, but his touch was steady. "This will sting," he warned. He pressed the carbolic-soaked rag to her palm. Maida hissed, a sharp intake of breath as the antiseptic bit into the raw wounds, but she did not pull away. He held her hand firmly until the worst of the tremor passed. Then, holding her hand up to the lantern light, he went to work. His movements were precise, economical. He braced her wrist with one hand and, with the other, gripped the first splinter. He pulled. It was deep, angled under the skin. She flinched, biting her lip, but she held still. 1. He dropped the dark sliver of wood to the floor. 2. A smaller one. 3. The last one was the deepest, and he had to probe for it. He wiped the blood away, applied a thick pine-smelling salve from another tin, and then, with surprising gentleness, wrapped her palm in a strip of the clean cotton. He tied it off, his knot quick and sure. She pulled her hand back, cradling it against her chest. The shaking had subsided, replaced by the deep throb of her palm and the spreading warmth from the stove. But the heat brought a new kind of misery. It was thawing her clothes, and the smell of her long day rose from the damp wool. The sour scent of fear. The smell of stale sweat from a day spent failing to sell bread in a cold market. She was acutely aware of the tear at her shoulder seam, where Price had grabbed her. It had ripped open, exposing the plain cotton shift beneath. Suddenly, in this small, clean, masculine space, she was overwhelmed by shame. Shame for her poverty, shame for the tear, shame for her own body, which felt too large, too heavy, too worn. She instinctively tried to pull the torn fabric closed, turning slightly away from him. Coulter saw the movement. He saw the flush that rose from her neck to her cheeks. He had seen that kind of shame in trapped animals. He stood up. He turned to a large wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He opened it and pulled out a thick, gray wool shirt, the same kind he wore, folded neatly. He also pulled out a heavy, multi-striped Hudson's Bay blanket. He did not hand them to her. He did not force the issue. He placed them on the far end of the bench, a respectful distance away. "The wet clothes will steal your heat," he said, his back still turned to her. "That shirt is clean. Put it on. Use the blanket." He gave her no time to argue or thank him. He walked to the door, picked up a heavy stable broom, and began sweeping the snow and ice he and Maida had tracked in. He focused on the task, his movements deliberate, his shoulders set, affording her the simple, profound courtesy of his complete distraction. Maida stared at his broad back. It was the decentest thing anyone had done for her in a year. Her fingers were stiff and cold, but she fumbled with the laces of her bodice. She shed the damp, torn wool dress, letting it fall to the floor. The biting air hit her skin for a single, shocking moment before she pulled the gray wool shirt over her head. It was huge. It fell to her knees, the sleeves covering her hands completely. It smelled not of sweat, but of lye soap, pine, and the faint, clean trace of the man himself. She quickly wrapped the heavy blanket around her shoulders, tucking it under her legs on the bench. For the first time that day, she felt a kernel of safety that was more than just heat. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was small. He only nodded, hanging the broom back on its peg. He moved back to the stove with a hooked poker. He lifted the lid on a heavy black pot that had been simmering on the back corner. A rich, savory steam billowed out, filling the cabin with the scent of pinto beans, chili, and smoked bacon. He ladled a thick portion into a wooden bowl, took a cast-iron skillet from the warming shelf, and cut a heavy wedge of cornbread from it. He handed the bowl and bread to her. She took it. She had not eaten since a dry crust that morning, perhaps 12 hours ago. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She tried to eat slowly, to maintain some small amount of dignity, but the soup was hot and thick, and she was starving. She finished the bowl quickly, wiping the last of the bean gravy with the crust of the cornbread. She set the empty bowl aside, her face hot, embarrassed to have eaten like an animal. Coulter ate his own portion standing by the stove, taking large, efficient bites. He looked at her empty bowl, then at the pot. He said nothing. He simply took her bowl, refilled it halfway, and placed another, smaller piece of cornbread beside it. He set it back in front of her. She looked up at him, her eyes questioning. "A body that can work needs to eat," he said, repeating his justification from the stable. It was not a judgment. It was a statement of fact. She accepted the second serving. She ate it slowly, the warmth spreading through her veins, pushing back the chill, pushing back the fear. As she ate, her eyes finally had the chance to scan the room. It was spare, functional, a single cot, a bedroll. Shelves were filled with tools, traps, neatly stacked tins, and boxes of rifle cartridges. And on the shelf directly above her head, next to a sharpening stone and a coil of rope, sat a small, half-finished wood carving. It was a piece of smooth cottonwood, sanded and partially oiled. The letters carved into it were deep and clear, Hollis. The spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale. Hollis, her husband's name. She stared at it, her vision blurring. The wood carving, the name of the man she had buried 2 years prior, sitting here on this stranger's shelf. The coincidence was too bizarre, too cruel. The tears she had refused Landon Price in the stable, the tears of humiliation, now threatened to fall for a different reason, a complex, aching grief. Coulter followed her gaze. He saw the shock in her eyes, the sudden tensing of her shoulders. He saw her composure, so hard-won, begin to crack. "It's just a name," he said, his voice quiet. "He's dead," she whispered. The spoon clattered as she dropped it into the empty bowl. "My husband, Arthur Hollis, he died of lung fever 2 winters past." The dam of her silence, the one she had maintained for months, finally broke. She didn't weep, not loudly, but the words tumbled out, fragmented and sharp, like broken glass. It wasn't just the fever, it was the debt, always the debt. He bought the land, you see, the parcel by the stream, the San Vireo. She looked at her bandaged hand, remembering the plans Arthur had made. He said the water was the future. He said it was our future. But the drought came, and he took sick. She looked up, her eyes pleading with him to understand. He died, but the debt stayed. Landon Price bought the marker from the bank in Santa Fe. He's been pressuring me for a year. The stall rent, the $2, that was just the excuse. It was never about the bread. "What does Price want?" Coulter asked. His voice was low, not pressing, just gathering facts. "The water," she said, her voice hoarse with a sudden, old anger. "Sheriff Dorn is in on it. They want me to sign away the water rights. They said if I didn't, they would find other ways. They would declare me unfit, a vagrant. They want the San Vireo. It's the only water in the Red Sage Basin that hasn't run dry this season." Coulter's face, which had been neutral, hardened. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He didn't ask any more questions. He didn't offer condolences for her husband. He turned to his main workbench, pushed aside a box of rifle cartridges and a set of harness buckles, and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook, the kind a surveyor or an engineer might use. He untied the thong and opened it on the small plank table. Maida, drawn by his intense, focused silence, stood up. She pulled the heavy blanket around her and walked over to the table. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, calculations of angles, lists of supplies, lumber, blasting powder, iron fittings, and on the center page, open under the lantern light, was a detailed, intricate drawing. It was a map of the Red Sage Basin. She recognized it immediately. She saw the cluster of small shacks that marked Juniper Crossing. She saw the outline of her own small, cursed parcel of land, marked clearly. And she saw the thin, vital blue line of the San Vireo stream that cut through it. But Coulter had drawn new lines. He had sketched a plan, a series of cuts into the rock, a long wooden flume, and a diversion channel. His plan showed the San Vireo stream being redirected, not north, toward the big cattle ranches that Price supplied. His lines ran south, toward the dusty, barren common pasture, the land used by the town's poorest settlers, the families with only a few goats, the washerwomen, the small-time farmers struggling with dry wells. He was planning to take the same water. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a new, different kind of dread. Was this a rescue, or had she just been traded from one thief to a more competent one? He saw the misunderstanding instantly. He tapped the drawing with a calloused finger. "Price wants to dam it, right here." He pointed to the head of the stream. "He dams it. He controls everything downstream. He sells it to the railroad or the big outfits. The basin dies." He then tapped his own, complex drawing. This opens it, cuts a channel to the common field, enough for everyone to get a share, enough for gardens, for livestock. You were going to steal it, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Can't steal what's locked up by a dead man's paper while the town starves, Coulter said, his voice flat. I was going to move it. He looked back at the small carving on the shelf. Hollis. I was tracking the name on the land deed, filed at the territorial office. I needed to know the man who was hoarding the water. I'm not hoarding, she said, a flash of her earlier spirit returning. I'm surviving. You were, he corrected, his voice quiet but firm. Until tonight. Tonight, they stopped trying to buy it from you. They started trying to take it, and they used $40 of my money to do it. The silence in the cabin settled again, but it was different now. It was charged. He knew her secret, and she knew his. He closed the notebook, the leather cover falling shut with a soft thump. He took her empty bowl and rinsed it in a wash bucket. He put another thick log of piñón in the stove, and the flames flared, casting shadows that danced on the stone walls. He refilled her cup with more hot water from the kettle, reviving the sage leaves. He didn't look at her when he pushed it across the table toward her. These small, silent actions, the addition of wood, the pouring of tea, the cleaning of the bowl felt more solid than any words of comfort. They were practical. They were real. The cot, he said, nodding to the simple frame against the far wall. Take it. Where will you sleep? She asked. I'm not sleeping. It was not a boast, just a fact. Maida was too exhausted to argue. The combination of the blizzard, the terror, the food, and the profound, bone-deep warmth of the cabin was a drug. She nodded. She lay down on the cot, pulling the heavy Hudson's Bay blanket over her, still wearing his dry wool shirt. She was asleep in moments. It was the first deep, dreamless sleep she had known in months. She did not stir when the fire popped. She did not hear the wind increase its shriek as midnight passed. Coulter Reyes did not sleep. He sat on the low bench, his back against the heavy, barred door, his legs stretched out. He pulled his Winchester rifle across his lap. By the low, steady light of the kerosene lantern, he took out his oil can and cleaning kit. He methodically, almost meditatively, began to clean the weapon. He oiled the lever action, wiped down the barrel, checked the mechanism. He listened to the steady, deep breathing of the woman sleeping in his cot, and he listened to the wind. It was changing direction, shifting from the north to the west, a sign the storm was settling in for a long siege. Outside, the blizzard raged. The snow fell harder, piling in great sculpted drifts against the cabin, sealing the door, burying the canyons. It covered the hateful, jeering tracks of the drunks at the livery. It covered the stable. It covered the deep indentations in the snow where Maida had been thrown against the stall. And it covered the hoofprints of his own mare, leading away. By morning, the snow would have erased every trace of the men who had tried to destroy her. But Coulter knew. As he chambered a fresh, brass cartridge and softly clicked the lever shut, that snow only covered, it never removed. The light that woke Maida was not the warm yellow of the lantern, but a cold, brilliant silver. It poured through the cabin's single, high window, a window she had not noticed in the dark. The blizzard had passed. The world outside was silent, buried, and painfully bright. She sat up, her body stiff and aching. She was still in Coulter's gray wool shirt, wrapped in the heavy blanket. The cot was surprisingly comfortable. The cabin was warm. The stove had been fed through the night. Coulter was gone. A brief, sharp panic seized her. Had he left her, taken her money and abandoned her to face Price alone? No. He had not taken her money. He had given the heavy duster she had worn was gone, as was his rifle from its pegs. But her basket of bread sat on the table, untouched. Her damp dress and cloak, which she had left in a miserable heap, were now hanging neatly from wooden pegs near the stove. Stiff, but dry. The heavy plank door scraped open, pulled from the outside against the resistance of a deep drift. Coulter entered, bringing a blast of frigid, clean air. He was covered in snow, his hat and shoulders white. He carried 2 dead rabbits by their feet in one hand and his rifle in the other. He stomped the snow from his boots. "The storm's broken," he said. He didn't look at her, busy hanging the rabbits in the cold lean-to. Drifts are 6 feet deep in the pass, but the wind is scouring the basin floor. Maida fumbled to get up, pulling the blanket around her. I should go. My goats. I have to." "They're fine," he said, cutting her off. He returned, closing and barring the door again. "I checked your shack first light. The lean-to held. I broke the ice in their bucket and threw them a bale of my own hay. They're better off than most." She stared at him, speechless. He had walked through a blizzard, in the dark, to care for her animals. Before she could form a thank you, there was a new sound, a sharp, insistent thumping on the cabin's outer wall. Not the door. It was too high. Coulter's head snapped up. He moved to the door, listening. The thumping came again, followed by a clear, female voice, muffled by the wood. "Coulter Reyes. I know you're in there. The snow's too deep to get to your door. I'm on the overhang." Coulter unbarred the door. He pushed, but the drift outside was solid. "The window! Cora!" he yelled. He climbed onto his workbench, unlatched the high window, and pushed it open. A cascade of loose snow fell in, along with a rush of blindingly bright air. A figure, bundled in so many scarves and coats, she looked round, was sitting sideways on a mule, which was standing on the wide, rocky overhang above the cabin, a place the wind had kept relatively clear. "Cora Lind," Coulter said to Maida, by way of introduction. "Town schoolteacher. And don't you forget it." Cora called down. Her voice was sharp, educated, and held no room for nonsense. "I've been riding since dawn. I went to your shack. Maida, I saw Coulter's tracks. I figured this was the only safe roof in the basin." "What is it, Cora?" Coulter asked, his voice strained from yelling up at the window. "It's Ridley," she shouted, her voice tight with anger. "Eamon Ridley. He's called an emergency auction. The Mesa Trust is foreclosing. He's selling the water rights to the San Vireo stream in 3 days. The blood left Maida's face, the warmth from the stove, from the sleep, vanished. She sank onto the bench, the blanket pooling at her feet. "He can't," Maida whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The debt isn't due, not for months." "He says it is." Cora called down, leaning precariously off her mule to be heard. "He's citing a non-payment clause from 2 years ago, from your husband's original note. He's saying the debt is in default, and he's seizing the collateral. He's posted the notice on the bank door and the saloon." "It's a lie," Maida said, her voice stronger, fueled by a sudden, cold fury. She stood up, walking to the workbench, her bare feet pressing into the cold stone floor. She looked up at the window. "It's a lie. Cora, Price, and Dorn, they forced me to sign a paper. Last week, they said it was a receipt for interest. A receipt, not a default." "Then you'd best find that paper." "Maida," Cora said, her voice softening slightly, "because Eamon Ridley is a snake, and he's got the law on his side." She pulled her mule's head around. "I have to get back. I have children waiting for a lesson. Storm or no, 3 days. Maida, that's all you have." Cora Lind and her mule disappeared from the square of the window. Coulter closed it, the thick glass muffling the world again. He latched it and turned, jumping down from the bench. He looked at Maida, his face an unreadable mask of rock and shadow. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the snow. "They forced you," he stated. It was not a question. Maida walked to her dried dress. She fumbled in the pocket, her bandaged hand clumsy, her good hand shaking. She pulled out a single, folded piece of paper, creased and slightly damp. "I kept it," she said, her voice flat. "I don't know why. I felt dirty signing it. But Sheriff Dorn was there. He held my hand. He held my hand and forced the pen into it." Price was laughing. She unfolded the paper and laid it on the plank table. It was a standard receipt from the Mesa Trust Bank, with lines of script scribbled in. It noted a payment of $5, which she had not made, and at the bottom, her signature, Maida Hollis. It was jerky, angled, the signature of a hand under duress. "Pastor Kelt," she said, the words tasting like ash. "He started it. After Arthur died, he began preaching. He never used my name. He just talked about the burden of the unproductive, about how a fat widow is a drain on a good town's charity. He made me a spectacle, a thing to be pitied and despised." She traced the line of her signature with a finger. "People stopped buying my bread, or they'd offer half. They'd look at me like I was a beggar. Then Price came. He knew I was isolated. He knew no one would stand for me. He and Dorn, they offered me this, just a formality. Maida. Dorn said, to show the bank you're cooperating. I knew it was a lie, but I signed. What else could I do?" Coulter looked at the paper. He didn't look at her. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He turned and retrieved his own leather-bound notebook. He opened it to the map of the basin and laid it on the table right next to the receipt. One was a document of theft. The other was a plan for rebellion. "This is what they want," he said, tapping the blue line of the San Virio on his map. "And this," he tapped the receipt, "is the hammer they're using to get it." His eyes narrowed. He leaned closer to the receipt, his gaze sharpening on a purple ink stamp in the bottom corner. It was the official seal of the Juniper County Sheriff's Office. "He was in a hurry," Coulter said, his voice a low growl. Maida looked. "What?" "The stamp," he pointed. "The eagle is flying down. The seal is upside down. Dorn was drunk, or he was careless. He didn't even stamp his own legal paper correctly. It's fraudulent." A tiny spark of hope, cold and sharp, lit in Maida's chest. Does it matter?" "It matters," he said. "It shows intent. It shows it was done in haste, without witnesses. It's a crack." He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers directly. "We need more than a crack. We need a wedge. Did anyone see this? See them force you?" "No," Maida whispered. "It was in the bank, after hours, just the three of us, me, Dorn, and Price. Ridley wasn't even there. He's too smart for that." "But he's not," Coulter said. He looked back at the door, as if remembering Cora's arrival. "Cora, she's smart. She wouldn't ride out here in a blizzard just to tell us bad news. She came to deliver a weapon. What else did she say?" Maida thought back, her mind racing. She mentioned children, waiting for a lesson, and she said Eamon Ridley is a snake." Maida paused. "No, that wasn't it. Before that, when I said they were lying." The memory surfaced. "She told me to find the paper, and she said I spoke to Alma Finch." "Alma Finch," Coulter repeated. The name landed in the room with a solid weight. Alma Finch was the town's midwife, a widow herself, but older, respected, and one of the few people in Juniper Crossing who could read and write as well as Cora Lind. She was untouchable. "Alma sees everything," Coulter said, a slow, grim understanding dawning on his face. "She's out at all hours. She delivers babies for the rich and the poor. She walks behind the church." "What did she see?" Maida asked. "She saw the payoff." Coulter said, "Cora didn't come to tell you that. She came to tell me. Alma Finch saw Eamon Ridley giving money to Sheriff Dorn." "When?" "It doesn't matter when. She saw it. A bank president giving bags of cash to the sheriff in the alley behind the House of God. That's our wedge." A noise from the corner made them both turn. It was a sharp clack. Maida's dry dress. The one Price had torn at the shoulder. had slipped from its peg and fallen to the floor. Cora's news had been the final straw. Maida walked over and picked up the dress. She looked at the rip, the threads hanging loose. This was the garment of a victim. And as she stood there, holding the proof of her own humiliation, another piece of Cora's message struck her. It came back, cold and sharp. "Wait," Maida said, her voice hardening. "Cora, she's not done. She's bringing something else. I can feel it. She'll be back." As if summoned by the words, the thumping came at the door. Not the high window this time. The door itself, heavy, solid, official. Coulter grabbed his rifle, levering around into the chamber with a quiet, lethal schnick. He moved to the side of the door, flattened against the wall. "Who is it?" he called. "It's me, Coulter, Cora Lind. Let me in. I have someone with me." Coulter looked at Maida, his eyes questioning. She nodded. He eased the hammer of the rifle back down and barred the door. He and Maida had to push together, their shoulders against the wood, to move the heavy drift. Cora Lind stood there, her face grim. Her mule was behind her. And next to her, looking uncomfortable and cold, was a young man in a worn, long coat with a tin star pinned to it. Deputy Rafe Coleman. "Cora," Coulter said, his voice flat, his eyes on the deputy. "Rafe." "Let us in, Coulter." Cora said, It's worse." They stepped inside, and Coulter barred the door. Deputy Coleman took off his hat, his youthful face pinched with cold and unease. "Rafe," Maida said, her voice shaking. "Are you here to arrest me?" "No, ma'am," Rafe Coleman mumbled, looking at his boots. I'm here because Miss Lind here insisted. I'm just the messenger." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded summons. It was not the cheap paper of the receipt. It was heavy. Official county letterhead. It's a summons. From the town council," he said. "From Pastor Kelt and Mr. Ridley. They've convened an emergency hearing. Tomorrow. At the town hall." "A hearing for what?" Coulter demanded, his hand still on his rifle. Deputy Coleman winced. They're calling it an inquiry into public morality and fitness, ma'am. Mrs. Hollis. They're going to declare you an unfit woman. A burden. They're going to use it to legally strip you of your property before the auction even happens." This was the final, brutal blow. It was not just about water. It was not just about debt. It was about her. They were going to publicly, legally, and morally destroy her. They were going to tear her name apart in front of the entire town. Maida Hollis looked at the summons in the deputy's hand. She looked at the torn dress in her own. She looked at the map on the table. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not faint. A cold, clean rage, purer than the snow outside, settled over her. She dropped the torn dress to the floor. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a honed blade. She walked to Coulter and picked up his heavy duster, the one he had given her in the stable, the one she had been wearing when he'd saved her. She put it on. It was still his, but she wore it like armor. She looked at Cora, then at the deputy. "They want to see me? They want to judge my fitness." She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "I can work," she said, her voice ringing with a power none of them had heard before. "I have worked. I pulled my husband's plow by hand when our mule died. I have baked bread with frozen fingers. I kept that stream clear of rockfall and beaver dams with my own sweat for 2 years, while those men sat in their warm offices and judged me. I am not a burden. I am the only reason that stream is still running at all." There was a heavy silence. Cora Lind smiled, a small, fierce smile. Deputy Coleman swallowed, visibly impressed. "Ma'am," he said, I don't like Sheriff Dorn. I don't like what he does. But he's the law." "Not this time. He isn't," Coulter said. He stepped forward, laying his rifle on the table. He was all business. The plan was forming, hard and fast. "Rafe," Coulter said, his voice sharp. "You're a witness. You just delivered a fraudulent summons. You know Dorn's hand is in this. Are you going to be Dorn's errand boy? Or are you going to be a deputy of the law?" Coleman looked trapped. "What can I do? It's his word against, well, against everyone." "Not everyone," Coulter said. "One, we have Alma Finch's testimony. Cora, you'll get it. Get her to write it down. Get her to sign it." Cora nodded, her eyes bright. "Done." "Two," Coulter pointed to the table. "We have a fraudulent receipt with a backward stamp, evidence of conspiracy." "Three," he looked at Maida. "We have the target." He tapped his own map. "This isn't about one widow's debt. This is about the water. This is about all the water." His gaze bored into the deputy. "This is the stake. Rafe, if Mesa Trust and Dorn get that stream, they put a lock on the headwaters. They'll control the entire Red Sage Basin. Every small rancher, every farmer, every family in town will be paying Ridley's price for a bucket of water. They will bleed this basin dry until the summer rains. If the rains come." The deputy's face hardened. He was a local boy. He had family in the basin. He understood. "What's the plan, Reyes?" he asked. "The plan is we fight back." Coulter said, "Cora, get Alma's statement. Rafe, you are going to be at that meeting. You are going to be our witness inside the law. And Maida." He turned to her. She was already in motion. She had found a needle and thread in a small tin on Coulter's shelf. She sat at the table, and with quick, angry, competent stitches, she began to mend the tear in her own dress. She was not hiding the damage. She was repairing it. "I'll be there," she said, not looking up from her work. "But I won't be begging." Cora and Rafe left, a new energy in their steps. The plan was set. Maida finished her sewing. The knot pulled tight. She folded her dress and placed it on the bench. She retied her scarf, pulling it tight around her hair. Then she did one last thing. She picked up a small piece of chalk from Coulter's workbench. On the dark, worn wood of the plank table, she began to write. It was a list. Bread, goats, evidence, meeting. She set the chalk down. She had organized her survival into a battle plan. She finally looked up at Coulter. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but she saw something in his eyes. Respect. For the first time since she had met him, Maida Hollis looked at Coulter Reyes not as a savior and not as a threat. She looked at him as a partner. Her eyes were no longer defensive. They were clear. They were cold. And they were ready. The Juniper Town Hall was not a hall. It was the largest room in the settlement, a converted trading post that served as a church on Sundays and a courtroom on Mondays. Today, it was a theater. The room was packed, shoulder to shoulder. The blizzard had broken, but the cold remained, and the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, damp leather, and the sour, excited sweat of a crowd that senses blood. Every bench was full. Men stood 3 deep against the back wall, their faces curious, hungry for the spectacle. This was better than a dogfight. At the front, on a raised plank stage, sat the judges. Eamon Ridley, president of the Mesa Trust Bank, sat in the center, his hands folded neatly on a sheaf of papers. He was a small, precise man in a clean suit, his face pale and smooth. Beside him, Sheriff Lyle Dorn, his bulk overflowing his chair, his star pinned crookedly to a stained vest, chewed on a cold cigar, and at the end, his face composed in a mask of pious sorrow, sat Pastor Obadiah Kelt, his Bible open in his lap. Landon Price was not on the stage. He leaned against a supporting post near the front, his arms crossed, a smirk fixed on his face, enjoying the proceedings. Maida Hollis and Coulter Reyes entered. A wave of silence, a physical thing, rolled through the room as the door opened, letting in the cold air. Every head turned. Maida had mended her dress. The seam was visible, a dark, thick line of thread. Not a mark of shame, but a scar of repair. She wore her own thin cloak, the one she had left in Coulter's cabin. Coulter, in his shirt sleeves, his heavy duster left behind, walked beside her. He carried nothing but his leather notebook. They did not huddle in the back. Maida walked steadily down the center aisle, her boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. She took a seat on the front bench, the one reserved for the accused. Coulter sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He was a solid wall of granite next to her. From the back, Cora Lind and the midwife, Alma Finch, slipped in and stood near the door, their faces set and grim. Deputy Rafe Coleman stood in his official capacity by the stage, his expression miserable, his eyes on the floor. Pastor Kelt stood up. He raised his hands, palms out. Let us begin this somber proceeding," he intoned, his voice filling the room, rich and practiced. "We are gathered not in judgment, though judgment must be passed. We are gathered in sorrow." His gaze, heavy and wet, settled on Maida. "The good book tells us of burdens, of those who cannot, or will not, carry their own weight." A low snicker ran through the back rows. Landon Price's smirk widened. "A town's health," Kelt continued, warming to his theme, "is like a body's. It cannot suffer a limb that draws sustenance but provides no strength. It must be examined for the good of the whole." He was not looking at her face. His eyes were on her shoulders, her waist, her hips. He was diagnosing her body as a sickness. "We are here to examine the fitness of our sister, Maida Hollis," he said, finally using her name, "to see if she is a fit and proper member of this community, or a weight that threatens to sink us all." The crowd stirred. Men nudged each other. A woman in the second row laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. Maida's face was pale, but she did not move. "He speaks of fitness," a voice said, low and clear. It was Maida. She had not stood, but her voice carried, cutting through Kelt's pious drone. "Then let him look," she said. She stood up, slowly. She turned, not to the pastor, but to the crowd. She did not clutch her cloak. She did not try to hide herself. She let her cloak fall open, revealing the mended dress, the solid, broad-shouldered body that had survived 2 winters of starvation and grief. "Look at me," she commanded. The room fell silent. Even Pastor Kelt was stunned, his mouth open. "You want to see me? You want to judge my fitness?" Her voice was not a plea, it was a hammer. "Then look clearly. This is the body that Landon Price tried to break in a stable. This is the body that Sheriff Dorn manhandled to forge a document. This is the body that pulled a plow when the mule died, and baked the bread that fed this town when your own cellars were empty." She took a step toward the stage, her eyes dark and furious, fixed on the 3 men. "You want to know if I am a burden, Pastor? You are right, I am. I am a burden to thieves. I am a burden to liars. And I am a burden to hypocrites." A collective gasp went through the room. This was not the broken, fat widow they had come to see destroyed. This was someone else. This is contempt," Ridley hissed, finding his voice. He banged a small gavel on the table. "This is not a trial of your body, woman. This is an inquiry into your legal standing." "Then let's talk about the law," Coulter Reyes said. He stood up, and the notebook was in his hand. He stepped onto the stage in 2 long, silent strides. He unceremoniously shoved Kelt's Bible aside and spread his hand-drawn map on the table. "This is the law, Ridley," Coulter said, his voice a low growl that made the crowd lean in. "This is the San Virio stream, and this is your plan." He tapped the map. "A dam, a lock, A toll booth for every drop of water in the basin. That is a crude fantasy, Ridley snapped. And this, Coulter said, is a crude fact. He pulled Maida's receipt from his pocket and slapped it down on the map. The law, a fraudulent receipt, forced signature, and... He tapped the purple stamp. A sheriff's seal, stamped upside down in such a hurry that he proved his own crime. Sheriff Dorn surged to his feet, his face purple. That's a lie. You have no proof. That's a legal document. I am the law in Juniper. No, a new voice said. It was Alma Finch, the midwife. She was walking down the aisle, her back straight. She was not a tall woman, but the crowd parted for her as if she were a queen. She was carrying a small, dirty canvas coin bag. The law is the truth, Sheriff, Alma said, her voice crisp and clear as the morning ice. And the truth is, I saw you 2 weeks ago, behind the church, after dark. I was coming from the Cooper girls' birthing. I saw you take this bag from Eamon Ridley's own hand. She reached the stage. She did not hand the bag to anyone. She opened the drawstring and dumped the contents on the table, on top of Coulter's map. It was not coins. It was silver dust. Fine, glittering, gray powder. Rock silver, Alma announced, her voice ringing in the stunned silence. From the assay office. Not coin of the realm, but that's what Mr. Ridley keeps in the back of the Mesa Trust vault for his private dealings. I know. My brother worked in that vault until Mr. Ridley fired him for being too honest. It has a smell, a particular, dusty, rock smell. The same smell that's on this bag, the same smell that was on Sheriff Dorn's hands the next day. Ridley was on his feet, his face the color of old paper. This is slander, an old woman's fantasy. Is it? A voice said. Deputy Rafe Coleman stepped forward, his hat in his hand, his young face pale but resolute. Sheriff, he said, his voice cracking only slightly, you told me last night that the law was you, that you were the law. I am, Dorn roared, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. And you are finished, boy. No, Rafe said. He held up a folded piece of paper. The law is the oath. Sheriff, the oath I took. And this, he held the paper high for the crowd to see, is the sworn testimony of Alma Finch, which I took and filed with the circuit judge's office in Santa Fe by telegraph 1 hour ago. It is official, and it accuses you, Sheriff Dorn, and you, Mr. Ridley, of conspiracy to defraud. The room exploded. The crowd surged forward, shouting, accusing. Ridley took a step back, his composure finally shattered. He looked terrified. Landon Price, however, was not. He had been waiting for this. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and let out a piercing, ugly whistle. The back door of the town hall burst open. 3 men stood there, silhouetted against the bright snow. They were not townsfolk. They were hard men, wearing long dusters, their hands resting on their holsters. Gunmen, hired muscle. The crowd's roar died. The people fell back, shoving each other to get away from the aisle. Price smiled. Looks like this meeting's over, he said, stepping away from the post. The council finds in our favor. The 3 gunmen began to walk slowly down the aisle, their eyes cold, their intentions clear. They were here to take the stage. Coulter Reyes did not move to his rifle. He had not brought one. He simply stepped off the stage, his hands empty and visible, and stood in the center of the aisle, blocking their path. The gunmen stopped. They looked at Coulter, then at Price. Coulter ignored them. He turned his back to them, a suicidal gesture. He faced the crowd, the townsfolk, the ranchers, the small, scared men who had come for a show. You heard him, Coulter said, his voice calm, conversational, but loud enough to fill the room. They're taking the water. He looked at a man in the 3rd row, a thin rancher named Hatcher. Hatcher, Your well ran dry last month. Your cattle are drinking alkali. You want water, don't you?" Hatcher's eyes met Coulter's. He swallowed. He looked at the gunman, then at the map. He slowly nodded. Coulter's gaze moved. "And you, Stevens, and you, Mac, your families are next." He turned, slowly, to face the three gunmen. Then he looked at the dozens of other cattlemen and ranchers standing against the walls. "The law's in Santa Fe," Coulter said, his voice flat. "But the water is here, and these three men, they can't stop all of us." There was a heavy, pregnant pause. Then, a sound, the scrape of a boot heel. Hatcher, the thin rancher, stepped out from the bench, standing a few feet behind Coulter. Then another, Stevens, Mac. All around the room, men who had been neutral spectators, men who had come to mock a widow, made a choice. They stepped away from the walls. They filled the aisle. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't have to. They just stood, a silent, grim mass of farmers and ranchers, their hands resting near their own worn holsters, their eyes fixed not on Coulter, but on Price's three gunmen. The gunmen stopped. They looked at the sea of hard, angry faces. They were three. The crowd was 50. The standoff was absolute. A single gunshot would turn the town hall into a slaughterhouse. Eamon Ridley saw it. He saw his power, his money, his gunmen, rendered useless. "Wait," he shouted, his voice high and thin. "Wait!" Pastor Kelt, seeing his chance, lunged for the rope on the wall and began yanking it frantically. The town bell, the one used for fires and Sunday service, began to clang, a discordant, panicked sound. "Order!" Kelt cried. "Let us pray, we must have order. The meeting is adjourned," Ridley shrieked over the bell. This is postponed. The auction will proceed in 3 days as posted, that is the law. The auction stands. This meeting is over." He grabbed his papers, shoving Alma's silver dust onto the floor, and scrambled off the side of the stage, disappearing through a back room. Sheriff Dorn, his face a mask of fury. His bluff called, stared at Rafe. "You're a dead man, Coleman," he spat. He, too, stalked off the stage, shoving people out of his way. Price looked at Coulter. His face was no longer smiling. It was a mask of pure, reptilian hatred. He gave a sharp jerk of his head to the gunmen. They backed away, slowly, their hands still on their guns, and melted out the back door. The bell stopped ringing. The crowd, their adrenaline fading, began to murmur, breaking apart. It was over, but nothing was solved. Coulter let out a long, slow breath. He turned to the table, gathered his map, and refolded Maida's receipt. He handed it to her. Maida took it. She stood up. She had not sat down once. She turned and began to walk, alone, back down the aisle. The crowd parted for her again, but this time, their eyes were different. The mockery was gone. The pity was gone. In its place was a new, unsettling mixture of awe, respect, and scrutiny. They looked at her not as a fat widow, but as the woman who had faced down Eamon Ridley, the woman who owned the water, the woman who had started a war. She walked out the front door, her head high, not looking back. Coulter waited a beat, letting her have her moment, then followed, a silent shadow in her wake. The 5 of them were gathered in the biting cold of Maida's own lean-to, the only place safe from prying eyes. The goats, sensing the tension, shifted and bleated softly in the adjacent stall. 3 days, Cora Lynn said, her voice a tight, clipped thing. She was rubbing her gloved hands together. "The auction is in 2 days now. That gives us tonight. My testimony from Alma is filed." Deputy Rafe Coleman said. He looked paler than he had in the town hall, the reality of his treason setting in. "But it's not enough. The telegraph from Santa Fe was clear. The circuit judge is snowed in up north. He's not coming. Ridley knows it. Dorn knows it. We are on our own." Then we can't stop the auction, Maida said, her voice flat. She was not defeated, just practical. No, Coulter said. He was hunkered down, scratching a design in the frozen dirt with a horseshoe nail. We can't stop it, but we can invalidate the seller. We can prove Ridley has no right to hold an auction. We need the fire, Alma Finch said, her voice surprisingly strong. She was bundled in a heavy shawl. My testimony was the smoke. We need the fire. The ledger, Rafe said, nodding. Everyone knows Ridley keeps 2 sets of books, his public ledger for the examiners, and his private one, the one where he logs his private ventures. With Dorn. Coulter said. He looked up, his eyes meeting Rafe's. Where is it? In his office, upstairs at the bank, in a locked desk inside a locked room. A steel door, Cora added, and bars on the windows. It's a vault. No, Coulter said, his voice quiet. He pointed his nail at the ground. It's a box, and every box has a weak seam. He has a stove, doesn't he, to heat the office? Cora's eyes widened. Yes, the chimney. It runs up the back wall. The one shared with the mercantile. The maintenance access for the flue. It's on the roof. I have the key. I'm on the town maintenance board. I'll go, Coulter said, standing up. No, Maida said. The word hung in the cold air. All 4 of them turned to look at her. You can't, she said, her voice firm. I've seen that crawl space. When I helped patch the mercantile roof last summer, it's narrow. The rafters are thin. 30 inches apart. You're too heavy in the shoulders. You'll put a boot through the ceiling. She looked at her own hands, then back at Coulter. I can do it. I'm sturdy. I can brace myself, distribute the weight. I can fit where you can't. She was claiming it. The word they used as an insult, she was using as a tool. Coulter looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw no fear in her eyes, only resolve. He gave a single, short nod. All right, but the office is locked. How do you get in? The records room, Cora said, catching the plan. The chimney flue passes the back wall of the upstairs records room. It's an old conversion. The wall is just brick and plaster. There must be a loose brick, an old vent. Good, Coulter said. He began to draw in the dirt again. A crude map of the bank's street. This is a 5-person job. We need to get Maida in, and we need to get Ridley out, and we need to handle the guards. Price's men, Rafe said. There are 2 of them, posted inside the bank since the meeting. They're playing cards by the stove. They're not guards. Coulter said, they're dogs, and dogs chase rabbits. He looked at Alma. Alma, you're the first rabbit. We need a diversion, a big one. Something to pull Ridley out from behind his counter. Alma Finch smiled, a grim, humorless expression. A seizure, a public one, right on the boardwalk in front of his door. I've seen enough of them in my time. I can make it convincing. It's a spectacle, Cora added, her eyes bright with the strategy. Ridley hates a public mess. He'll have to come out to clear the doorway. He's too proud not to. That's your window, Maida. When Ridley is outside, Coulter continued. The guards will be at the window, watching. That's when I start the second diversion. I'll pull them away from the bank. How? Maida asked. A phantom shootout, Coulter said, his face devoid of expression. He laid out the plan, his voice low and precise. Alma would fake her seizure. This would draw Ridley out. Coulter, from a high vantage point, would fire his rifle. Not at a person, but at a target, far away, to simulate a fight. This would draw Price's men. Cora would use her key to get Maida onto the roof and into the crawl space. Maida would find the ledger. She would carry her bread basket, as she always did, to hide it. And me? Rafe asked, his voice nervous. You, Coulter said, are the law. You'll be on patrol. When you hear my shots, you ride, but you ride slow. You're not responding to a fight. You're responding to a public disturbance at the bank. You are the cleanup. You get there. You'll find Ridley fuming, his guards gone. You use that. You make it official. You buy us time. The plan was set. They moved as darkness fell. The main street of Juniper Crossing was quiet, the air cold and sharp. Alma Finch, wrapped in her shawl, began her walk. Cora and Maida, carrying the basket, slipped into the dark alley behind the mercantile. Coulter scaled the wall of the feed store opposite the bank, his rifle strapped to his back, and settled on the flat roof, a ghost in the shadows. Rafe was a block away, walking his horse. Alma reached the front of the Mesa Trust. Through the window, the light was warm. She could see Price's two gunmen laughing, their boots up on Ridley's clean desk. Alma clutched her heart. She let out a low, terrible moan and crumpled onto the boardwalk. She didn't just fall, she collapsed, her body striking the wood with a solid, sickening thud. She began to twitch, her heels drumming a frantic, awful rhythm on the planks. "Lord God," a man shouted from the saloon porch. "It's the midwife, she's in a fit." Inside the bank, the gunmen looked up. They saw the crowd gathering. Eamon Ridley appeared from the back room, his face a mask of profound annoyance. He stormed to the front door and unlocked it. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, stepping out onto the boardwalk. "Clear this area, someone fetch Doctor." On the roof across the street, Coulter smiled. He settled the butt of his rifle against his shoulder. He saw Ridley, exposed. He saw the two gunmen get up from the desk and walk to the front window, peering out to watch the spectacle. Now, Coulter looked past them, 2 streets over, to the dark, skeletal shape of the old livery stable, the one from that first night. A rusted, moldy bell still hung from its gable. He aimed. Clang! The rifle shot was a flat, hard crack in the night air, followed a half-second later by the ringing of the bell. The two gunmen spun from the window. "What in hell was that?" one said. Ridley looked up, furious. "Someone's drunk!" Coulter worked his lever, chambered another round, and fired again. Clang! "That ain't drunk," the second gunman said, his hand on his pistol. "That's a fight. It's coming from the old livery." He looked at his partner. "Come on." They forgot Alma. They forgot Ridley. They sprinted from the bank, their boots pounding the street, running toward the sound of the ghost fight. "Fools!" Ridley screamed after them. He was alone, on his boardwalk, with a dying woman and a crowd of gawkers. At that exact moment, on the roof of the bank, Maida Hollis was lowered into the black, dusty crawl space. Cora handed her the bread basket and the small pry bar. "Godspeed, Maida," she whispered, and closed the grate. Maida was alone in the dark. Dust filled her nose, the smell of ages. She crawled on her hands and knees, bracing her weight on the wide, sturdy rafters, just as she'd planned. Her body, her burden, moved with solid, quiet purpose. She reached the chimney stack. She felt along the plaster wall of the records room. Her fingers found it, a single brick, loose in its mortar. She worked the pry bar and the old plaster crumbled. The brick came free with a soft scrape. She pulled it out and set it down. A square of deeper darkness opened up. She slid through, feet first, dropping silently onto a pile of old newspapers in the records room. She moved to the main office door, locked, but this was an internal wall. She used the pry bar, put her shoulder into it, and the flimsy lock plate splintered. The door swung open. She was in Ridley's office. It smelled of tobacco, old paper, and money. She went to his desk. She didn't rifle the drawers. She went to the floorboards beneath it, just as Rafe had guessed. She found the one with a warped edge. She used the pry bar. The board came up with a low groan. And there it was. Not a green book. A heavy, rectangular parcel wrapped in dark, oiled canvas. Her hands shook so badly she could barely untie the string. She opened it. It was the ledger. She opened the first page. Her eyes scanned the neat, spidery script. L. Dorn. Payment for services, $500. L. Dorn. Land seizure fee, $200. L. Price. Acquisition bonus, $100. It was all there. She shoved the ledger into her basket, under the 3 dry loaves of bread she'd brought as cover. She turned to go. She hoisted herself back toward the hole into the records room. As she swung her leg up, the fabric of her mended dress caught on the jagged edge of the broken door jamb. There was a small, sharp pop. She felt it go, a button, a small, brass button from her husband's old cavalry coat, one she had used to replace a lost one on her own dress. She heard it hit the floor. It rolled, a tiny, metallic sound, disappearing into the darkness under Ridley's desk. She froze. She could not go back. She heard shouting from the street. Ridley's voice, high and angry. She scrambled through the hole, pulled the brick back into place, and crawled as fast as she could back to the grate, the basket heavy on her arm. On the street, Coulter saw Cora's signal. He whistled, a low, sharp sound that cut through the night. Deputy Rafe Coleman, who had been ambling his horse, suddenly spurred him into a canter. He rode up to the bank, where Ridley was fuming and Alma Finch was beginning to wake up, groaning about a bad oyster. Mr. Ridley, Rafe called, swinging down, his face a mask of official concern. He held up a folded piece of paper. There's a report of a disturbance and gunfire on account of the ongoing investigation. I'm authorized to place a temporary seal on this bank until the marshal arrives. It was a complete fabrication, a piece of paper from his own notebook. But in the chaos, with his guards gone, Ridley's nerve broke. This is an outrage and abuse of... Just following procedure, sir, Rafe said, shouldering past him and tying the paper to the door handle. Town's jumpy. Best you lock up and head home. For your own protection, of course. The bluff worked. It scattered the crowd. And in the confusion, 2 women, a schoolteacher and a widow carrying a basket of bread, walked away from the scene, melting into the shadows of the alley. They did not run. They just walked. The clouds, which had been gathering, finally closed, blotting out the stars. A new storm was coming. An hour later, Eamon Ridley was back in his office. Rafe's seal was gone, but the banker was terrified. He knew this was not random. He tore his office apart. He saw the splintered door jamb. He saw the dislodged brick. He saw the empty space beneath the floorboard. He was ruined. He sank into his chair, his mind racing. Who had the nerve? Who had the knowledge? His eyes scanned the floor. He was a man of details. He looked for anything, any clue. And under the shadow of his desk, he saw it, a tiny, dull gleam. He knelt and picked it up. A single, small, brass button, plain, worn, utterly unremarkable. He had seen it before. He held it in his palm. His blood turning to ice, he remembered. The town hall, the defiance, the mended dress she had worn with such pride. He dropped the button as if it were a hot coal. He did not call for Rafe. He did not go to the saloon. He ran to the back of the town hall, where the heavy emergency drum, the one used to call the posse, was kept. He grabbed the heavy wooden mallet. He dragged the drum into the center of the street. He took a breath, and he began to beat it. Boom! The sound was a deep punch to the gut of the night. Boom! A call to arms. Boom! 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 The alarm echoed off the high rocks of the basin. The hunt was on. The deep, resonant boom of the drum was a visceral punch to the gut. It was not a sound of alarm. It was a sound of summons, a call for the posse, a call for the hunt. Coulter was already moving. He burst into the lean-to, his face a mask of grim urgency. Now, Maida, we have to run. He had not unsaddled his mare. She was waiting, her reins looped, his rifle already in its scabbard. Maida's goats, sensing the panic, were a chorus of frantic bleating. "My things," she started, grabbing for her basket, the one that held the ledger. "Leave it," he said, his voice flat. "No," she said, her voice steel. "It's what we did this for." She clutched the basket to her chest. He didn't argue. He grabbed her arm, pulled her from the lean-to, and half threw her into his saddle. He swung up behind her, his body a solid wall, his arm encircling her waist to hold her and the basket in place. He kicked the mare into a hard gallop. They thundered out of the small yard, leaving the goats and the shack behind. They hit the main track just as the first torchlight appeared at the edge of Juniper Crossing. Shouts echoed across the basin. "There, Reyes, he's got the woman." Sheriff Dorn's voice, thick with rage, and prices high and venomous. $500 to the man who brings them down. The night air was cold, but the wind had shifted. It was coming from the south now. A strange, warm, dry wind that smelled of dust. "Where are we going?" Maida shouted over the pounding of hooves. "Home," he said, his voice a growl in her ear. "My cabin, the rocks. It's the only place we can defend." The mare was fast, sure-footed in the dark, but the posse was large. They were fanning out, a dozen riders, spreading across the basin floor to cut off any escape to the high country. Dorn, Price, and the 3 gunmen were leading the charge, their horses fresh. They rode for an hour, a desperate, lung-bursting race through the darkness, the sound of the pursuit always just behind them. A chorus of yelps and curses carried on the rising wind. The moon was obscured by a gathering haze. As the first sickly gray light of dawn broke, the wind changed from a rush to a howl. The air turned a gritty, opaque red. A dust storm, one of the terrible spring squalls, was boiling up from the south. "Hold on!" Coulter yelled. He wrenched the mare's head, pulling her off the main track. They were at the mouth of Coyote Notch, a narrow, winding split in the rock that was less a canyon and more a scar. It was a treacherous shortcut, known for flash floods and rock slides. "They'll follow our tracks," Maida cried. "The wind will cover them," he said, urging the horse into the narrow opening. The ground here was not dirt, but slick rock. It left no tracks to follow. The walls of the notch rose up around them, cutting off the dim light. The wind shrieked above their heads, a sound like a giant tearing canvas. Here, inside the rocks, the air was still and hot, the silence after the open chase oppressive. The mare slowed, her hooves clicking nervously on the stone. "They'll wait for us at the cabin," Coulter said, his voice strained. "Dorn knows where I live. They'll just wait us out." "So what do we do?" "We climb," he pointed up. The notch had a side canyon, a steep, near-vertical chimney of loose rock and scree. It was not a path for a horse. "We can't," she breathed. "We have to." He slid from the horse, his body stiff. He came around and looked up at her, his face caked in a mask of red dust. "They'll find the horse. They'll know we're in here. We have to be gone before they do." He untied the heavy coil of rope from his saddle, looped it over his shoulder, and unslung his rifle. He left everything else. "Give me the basket," he said. He slung it over his other shoulder, the ledger a heavy weight against his back. Then he held up his arms. "Your turn." She slid down, her legs trembling so badly she almost fell. The ground was tilted, the rock face looming. "I can't," she whispered. "Coulter, I can't climb that." "Yes, you can." He grabbed her hand. "The horse is one thing, this is another. You use your hands, you use your feet, and you don't look down." He started to climb, and she had no choice but to follow. It was a brutal, agonizing ascent. The rock was sharp, crumbling under her fingers. Her dress, the mended dress, snagged on every outcrop. Her heavy skirts were a liability, threatening to trip her, to pull her backward into the void. Halfway up, her foot slipped. She lost her balance, gasping, her body swinging out over the 50-foot drop. She cried out, a small, terrified sound. Coulter, 5 feet above her, had anchored himself. He was holding her, not by her hand, but by the front of her dress. His fist clenched in the fabric at her chest. He held her weight, his arms straining, his face inches from hers. "Don't look down," he gritted, his voice a low, furious command. "Find your footing. Left foot, to the right. There's a ledge." She was sobbing, blind with terror, but she did as he said. She fumbled with her boot, found the solid rock, and pushed. He hauled her up, his strength immense, and deposited her on the ledge beside him. They were both breathing in great, ragged gasps. "You can't," he panted, his voice raw. "You can't climb in this, not with them behind us." He was looking at her skirts. Without a word, he set down his rifle, pulled his skinning knife from his belt, and knelt. He grabbed the hem of her dress. "Coulter, no," she said, scandalized, pulling back. "They can have your dignity, or they can have your life," he snapped, not looking at her face. "Choose." He did not wait for an answer. He began to cut. The knife was sharp. He hacked at the heavy wool, severing the stitches, sawing through the fabric, until the dress was severed at her knees. He did the same with her heavy petticoats. The fabric, her burden, fell away, tumbling down the rock face into the shadows below. She was left in her drawers, her boots, and the top of her dress, which now looked like a ragged tunic. She felt naked, exposed, humiliated. Coulter stood up. He didn't look at her body. He looked at her face. "Now, you can climb," he said. He grabbed his rifle and started up the rock again. And she did. Freed from the weight, she moved. She climbed. She used her legs, her hands. She found a strength she didn't know she had, a strength born of pure, desperate rage. They reached the top as the sun was passing its zenith. The wind hit them like a physical blow, a solid wall of red, screaming dust. They were on a high mesa, a windswept, barren place. "This way," Coulter yelled, pulling her along. Below them, in the notch, they heard the first shouts. The posse had found the mare. They ran across the top of the mesa, the wind trying to tear them apart, the dust scouring their skin. They ran until Maida's lungs felt like they were full of fire. At the far end of the mesa, tucked into a fold in the rock, was a low structure she hadn't seen. A hay shed, a line cabin, used by ranchers during roundup. It was old, the wood silvered and leaning, but the roof looked solid. Coulter shoved the door open. It wasn't a door, just a sheet of tin on leather hinges. They fell inside, collapsing onto the musty, dry-smelling hay. For a full minute, they just lay there, choking, gasping, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The only sound was the shriek of the wind outside and their own ragged breathing. We made it," Maida panted, her voice a raw croak. Coulter pushed himself up. He was already at the door, peering through a crack. "They're in the notch," he said. "They'll be climbing. We bought an hour, maybe." He turned back, and for the first time, he saw her. The light in the shed was dim, filtered through the thousands of dust motes dancing in the air, caught in the sunbeams slicing through the gaps in the plank walls. She was covered in a thick layer of red dust. Her hair was down, a wild, tangled mess. Her face was streaked with sweat and grime. Her dress was a ruin, her legs and arms bare and scratched. And she was trembling. It was not from cold. The shed was hot, the air thick. It was a tremor that started deep inside her, a vibration of pure, unspent terror and violation. "Maida," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He cut my dress," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He cut my dress, and I let him." She looked at her scratched legs, the raw skin. "He looked at me. They all looked at me." Coulter crossed the small space in 2 strides. He knelt in the hay in front of her. "I'm sorry," he said. It's not you." She was not crying. Her eyes were dry, burning. It's them. It's Pastor Kelt. It's Landon Price. It's Eamon Ridley. It's my husband, Arthur. He always said, 'Keep yourself modest. Maida, a big woman must be doubly careful not to offend.'" She let out a sound, a bitter, half laugh, half sob. "I have spent my whole life trying to be invisible, trying not to offend, trying to apologize for the space I take up." She finally looked at him, her eyes wide and desperate, full of a pain that was older than the posse, older than the debt. "I am so tired," she whispered, the words a confession. "I am so tired of being judged by my body." Coulter did not move. He just watched her, his own face a mask of red dust, his eyes in the gloom unreadable. He reached out, not to comfort her, not to pat her. He reached out and, with one calloused, dirty thumb, he gently brushed a tear track of clean skin where the dust had been washed away. "This body," he said, his voice a low, rough thing, just above the sound of the wind. "This body just outclimbed a dozen men. This body just hauled a 30-pound ledger up a cliff face." His gaze was not on her legs. It was on her face. It was on her eyes. "This body," he said, "pulled a whole winter back from the brink. It carried you through a blizzard. It carried you through starvation. It's carried you through grief." He leaned a fraction of an inch closer, his voice dropping even lower, a secret in the swirling dust. "I have seen what this country does to people. It breaks them. It grinds them thin. It leaves them as husks." His hand, the one that had brushed her cheek, did not pull away. It rested on her jaw, his palm rough, his touch surprisingly warm. "Your body didn't break," he said. "I don't find it a burden. I find it beautiful." She stopped trembling. His words sank into her, not as flattery, but as a truth she had never, ever heard. He was not talking about her appearance. He was talking about her substance, her worth. She leaned into his hand, a small, involuntary movement. Her eyes searched his, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, of desperation. It was a kiss of certainty. It was slow. It was warm. His lips were dry, chapped, and they tasted of dust and salt and the faint, sharp tang of wild mint from the herbs in his pocket. It was a kiss that said, "I see you." She did not pull back. She met him. Her own hand came up, resting on his shoulder, not to pull him closer, but just to hold on. He pulled back, but only an inch. They stayed there, foreheads touching, breathing the same dusty air. His other hand came up, settling on her shoulder, his grip firm, respectful. His hands were on her shoulders, on her back, a simple, solid embrace that was about shelter, not possession. Maida closed her eyes, overwhelmed. She felt a safety so profound it was almost painful. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the warm, solid column of his neck, just below his jaw. She could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat against her skin. It was the calmest, surest thing in the world. As she shifted, the scarf she had tied around her hair, now loose, slipped from her head. It fell, a dark pool of fabric, into her lap. Coulter felt the movement. He pulled his head back. He looked at the scarf, then at her. He saw her, vulnerable, her hair unbound, her heart in her eyes. He could have kissed her again. He could have taken advantage of the moment, the raw emotion, the heat, the isolation. He didn't. He reached down, his movement slow, almost tender. He picked up the scarf. It was the simple, worn wool one she always wore. He held it in his rough hands, as if weighing it. Then, with a gentleness that belied his appearance, He carefully, respectfully, began to wrap it back around her head, tucking the loose strands of her hair back into place, restoring her armor, restoring her dignity. It was the most profound act of love she had ever known. Respect, chosen over desire. She sat, still as stone, letting him do it. When he was finished, his hands lingered for a moment on the fabric, his fingers brushing her temples. "The wind's dying," he said, his voice low. She listened. He was right. The high, demonic shriek had fallen to a low, steady moan. "They're coming," she said. "They're coming," he agreed. Outside, in the distance, they heard the sound of hoofbeats, muffled by the dust, and the faint cry of men calling to each other. The posse had reached the top of the mesa. They were spreading out, hunting. Coulter and Maida did not move. Still kneeling in the hay, they looked at each other, their choice made, their alliance sealed in a way that was deeper than a kiss. He stood up. He offered her his hand, not to cherish, but to raise. "We're not done," he said. "No," she said, taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. "We're not." He grabbed the rifle. She grabbed the basket. They turned, together, to face the door. The sun was a brutal, copper-colored eye. The dust storm had passed, leaving the air scoured and unnaturally clear, but a fine layer of red grit covered everything. It was on the boardwalks, on the roofs, and in the mouths of the people gathered in front of the Mesa Trust Bank. The auction was set for 10 o'clock. It was 10:05. Eamon Ridley stood on the bank's front steps, a wooden gavel in his hand. Sheriff Dorn was beside him, his face bloated, his eyes scanning the crowd with a possessive, smug expression. Price's 3 gunmen, their hands on their holsters, formed a half circle at the bottom of the steps, keeping the crowd back. Landon Price himself was perched on the railing of the saloon porch across the street, a rifle resting across his lap, watching. "Ahem," Eamon Ridley said, his voice thin and reedy, cutting through the murmurs. "We are gathered for the lawful, public auction of the property known as the San Virio water rights, collateral on a defaulted note held by the Mesa Trust. We will open the bidding at $5,000. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was an impossible sum, a price designed not to start a bidding war, but to end one. It was designed to ensure only one buyer. $5,000, a rancher in the back yelled. "That's theft. Ridley, you mean to buy it yourself?" "It is the price of the debt, sir," Ridley said, smiling his thin, pale smile. "The law protects property, and before we begin this legal transaction, Pastor Kelt has a few words for us to set the moral tone." Pastor Obadiah Kelt stepped forward. He held his large, black Bible in one hand. He did not open it. He looked out at the crowd, his face a mask of sorrowful duty. "My friends," he began, his voice a sonorous, practiced thing. "The body of a town is a holy thing, but it can sicken. It can be poisoned by a member that refuses to heal, by a member that draws life from the whole but gives nothing back, by a member that, through indolence and gluttony, becomes a weight, a dead weight. The good book tells us." "He's lying." The voice was not loud. It was low, raw, and full of dust. Every head in the crowd turned. They were walking down the center of the street. Not running, not in custody. They were walking. Coulter Reyes and the widow, Maida Hollis. They were a sight from a fever dream. Coulter was caked in red dust, his shirt torn, his eyes burning in a face that looked more like a mask of clay. He carried his rifle, not aiming it, but holding it at his side. A clear statement. Maida was. She was a ruin. Her dress was hacked to pieces at the knee. Her legs and arms were covered in scratches and dried blood. Her hair was matted with grime. She was carrying her simple, worn bread basket. They looked like they had been to hell and walked most of the way back. Sheriff Dorn's jaw dropped. Landon Price sat bolt upright on the railing, bringing his rifle to the ready. Maida and Coulter did not stop until they were at the foot of the bank's steps, standing directly in front of Pastor Kelt, inside the half-circle of gunmen. The crowd was absolutely, deathly silent. You are not welcome here, woman," Kelt stammered, his composure breaking. "This is a place of law." "Then let's have the law," Maida said. Her voice was a rasp. She turned, not to Kelt, but to the crowd. "You came to see a show. You came to see the fat widow destroyed. You came to watch them take my land, my water, my name." She looked at Ridley. "But you're too late." "This is madness," Ridley hissed, his face white with fury. "This auction is proceeding. Remove them." "Sheriff." Dorn took a step, his hand on his pistol. "I wish to speak," Maida said, her voice rising, ringing with a strange, cold power. "You gave the pastor a chance to talk about my weight. Now, I will speak about his." She reached into her basket. She did not pull out a gun. She pulled out the heavy, canvas-wrapped ledger. She held it up for the crowd to see. "This," she said, "is Mr. Ridley's private Bible, the one he doesn't read in church." She handed the ledger to the person standing nearest to her in the crowd. It was Cora Lind. Cora, her face pale but her eyes blazing, had been waiting. She took the book. "Give me a boost. Hatcher," she said. The thin rancher, the one who had stood with Coulter in the town hall, cupped his hands. Cora stepped into them, scrambling onto the back of a buckboard wagon, high above the crowd. She opened the book. "What is this?" Ridley shrieked. "This is private property. Stolen sheriff. Arrest them." Dorn lunged. He was not reaching for Maida. He was reaching for the book, his face a mask of panic. He grabbed for the wagon. "Give me that! You—" "Sheriff Dorn." A new voice. Deputy Rafe Coleman. He was no longer the scared boy. He was standing on the boardwalk, a piece of paper in his hand, his pistol drawn and aimed not at the crowd, but at the sheriff. "Sheriff Lyle Dorn," Rafe said, his voice shaking but loud. "You are under arrest." "What?" Dorn roared, spinning to face his deputy. "Are you insane? Boy, I'll have your badge, I'll have your life." "You're under arrest," Rafe repeated, "for conspiracy to defraud, accepting bribes, and falsifying legal documents, based on the sworn testimony of Alma Finch." "An old woman's lies," Dorn spat. "And," Rafe yelled, his voice cracking, "on the evidence of the Mesa Trust private ledger." Cora Lind's voice soared over the chaos. "Page 32, she shouted, her voice like a school bell. 2L, Dorn payment for services. Non-collection of Hollis debt, $500. The crowd exploded. "Page 40, Cora cried, her voice triumphant. 2L, Dorn bonus, land seizure fee, $200. Page 41, 2L, price acquisition bonus, $100. It's all here, every bribe, every theft." Dorn let out a roar of pure animal rage. He lunged at Rafe, his pistol coming up. "You're dead." He never had the chance. Coulter, moving in a blur, slammed the stock of his rifle into the back of Dorn's knee. The sheriff's leg buckled, and he went down, his shot going wild into the boardwalk. Coulter's boot came down on Dorn's wrist, and the pistol skittered away. "This is not law!" Eamon Ridley screamed, his voice a high-pitched shriek. He was trapped on the steps, the crowd now surging forward, held back only by the terrified gunmen. "This is mob rule. The law supports property. The law supports the bank. The law does not support." It does not support her weight. The words, venomous and precise, cut through the noise. The crowd went silent again, waiting. Maida Hollis, her ruined dress flapping, her face a mask of dust and triumph, turned. She looked up at the small, quivering banker. She let the silence stretch. Then she spoke, her voice clear, calm, and carrying over every head. "No one marries a fat widow, sir," she said. The words, the ones from the stable, the ones that had defined her shame, hung in the air. Ridley almost smiled. "But I can work," Maida said. The smile died. "I can work," she repeated, her voice building, a deep, resonant bell. "And I have worked, and I will keep working, not for you, not for him, but for this basin, and I will work to see this water run free." It was a declaration of war. It was a statement of fact. For a second, there was silence. Then, from the back, the rancher named Hatcher let out a full-throated roar. "To the water!" It was like a lightning strike. The crowd surged. The small, dry goods ranchers, the ones who had been silent, the ones who had come to watch, suddenly realized this was their fight. They surged forward, not at Ridley, but past him, toward the bank doors. The three gunmen, seeing 100 angry ranchers, their faces grim, their hands on their own pistols, simply let them go. They raised their hands and backed away, their job not worth their lives. And then the mothers, the women of the town, who had been standing on the edges, saw it. They saw Cora. They saw Alma. They saw Maida. They saw a woman who had refused to be broken, a woman who had been insulted, assaulted, and hunted, and who was still standing. One of them, Mrs. Stevens, grabbed a wooden shipping crate from in front of the mercantile. She flipped it over. Another woman grabbed a broken wagon spoke. Boom! She struck the crate. Boom! Another woman grabbed a tin pail. Clang! Boom! Clang! Boom! A rhythm, a drum beat. The women of Juniper Crossing, the washerwomen, the mothers, the baker's wife began to beat on crates, on pails, on the boardwalk itself. An irregular, furious, joyful rhythm of support. It was a rebellion. What is the meaning of this? A new voice. It was not a shout. It was a calm, deep baritone. It cut through the drumming, the shouting. A man on a tall, black horse had ridden up. He was not from here. He was broad-shouldered, with a graying mustache, and he wore a clean, long black coat. Pinned to it was not a tin star, but a heavy, polished silver one, a territorial marshal. He looked at the scene. He saw a man in a banker's suit cowering on the steps. He saw a disarmed sheriff on the ground, his face in the dirt. He saw a young deputy with a pistol and a warrant. He saw a woman on a wagon reading from a ledger. And he saw 100 people in a state of open, joyous insurrection. "Marshal Whit Rowan," he announced, his voice carrying, "I'm here on a telegraph from a Deputy Coleman. I was told there was a problem with the law in this town." Rafe Coleman, his face shining with sweat, his hands shaking, lowered his pistol. "Marshal," he said, his voice full of relief. He walked over and handed the marshal the entire file, Alma's testimony, his own report. Marshal Rowan read. He did not hurry. The crowd waited. The drumming stopped. He read for a full minute. Then he looked up. He looked at Ridley. "Mr. Ridley," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "This ledger, is it yours?" It was stolen," Ridley squeaked. "I will take that as a yes," the marshal said. He looked at Coulter. "Son, I appreciate you holding the sheriff. You can let him up, gentlemen," he said to two men in the crowd. "Cuff Mr. Ridley." You can't," Ridley shrieked, as two ranchers grabbed his arms. "I can," the marshal said. "I am placing the Mesa Trust Bank under the seal of the New Mexico Territory, pending a full investigation into fraud and conspiracy. This auction is void. The property is in dispute." Pastor Kelt, who had been frozen against the wall, saw his moment. He simply evaporated. He slipped into the alley, his Bible clutched to his chest, and was gone. Lyle Dorn, his face a mask of absolute, bottomless hatred, was pulled to his feet. He looked at Rafe. He looked at Maida. He didn't say a word. He unpinned his crooked star and threw it in the dust. He, too, was cuffed. Landon Price, on the saloon porch, had watched it all. He had seen his gunmen fade. He had seen Ridley and Dorn fall. He lowered his rifle. He did not run. He calmly stood, walked to his horse, mounted it, and with a final, long, hateful look at Maida, he turned the horse and trotted, slowly, out of town. Cora Lind, triumphant, jumped down from the wagon. She ran into her schoolhouse and came back with a piece of slate and a chalk. She scribbled on it and hung it on a nail on the bank's front door, right over the auction notice. It read, San Virio Water Public Trust by Sweat Equity. The crowd cheered. It was a carnival. They had won. Maida stood in the middle of it all, the noise washing over her, the basket still in her hand. She was the eye of the storm. Coulter came to her side. He was not cheering. He was watching the dust cloud, now far down the basin, where Landon Price had disappeared. He looked at Maida. Her face was radiant, transfigured by the victory. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice just for her. She looked at him, her joy fading slightly, replaced by the grim reality he was right. But the tide had turned. The entire town was looking at her, not with pity or mockery or scorn. They were looking at her with awe. They were looking at their leader. The celebration in Juniper Crossing was a ragged, nervous thing. Men who had been enemies an hour before were now clapping each other on the back, sharing flasks in the middle of the street. They had deposed a sheriff, broken a bank, and reclaimed their water, but the victory felt thin, brittle. Marshal Rowan was at the telegraph office, wiring Santa Fe, his face grim. Dorn and Ridley were in the town's single-cell jail, but Landon Price was gone. His dust cloud was a fading, angry smudge on the horizon. Maida and Coulter did not stay for the celebration. They walked, their bodies aching, past the cheering men, past the women beating their joyful rhythm. They retrieved Coulter's mare from the livery, where she had been found and returned, and rode in silence back to the cabin in the Red Sage Basin. "It's not over," he had said. She knew he was right. Price was not a banker, to be defeated by laws. He was not a corrupt official, to be unpinned by a marshal. He was a creature of spite, and he was still free. That night, the stars were sharp, cold pinpricks in a black sky. The town was asleep, exhausted by its own rebellion. The basin was silent. Coulter was not asleep. He sat on the bench outside his cabin, his rifle across his lap. He was listening. Maida was inside. She had washed the grime from her face and arms, her skin stinging, her mended dress, now a ruin, was in a pile. She was wearing his gray wool shirt again, the one that felt like home. She was binding her own scratched legs with clean cotton strips. She came to the door, a cup of hot sage tea in her hand. "You should rest." "He'll come back," Coulter said, not looking at her. "He won't let it go. Not this." "He'll come for me," she said. It was not a question. "He'll come for the water." Coulter corrected. "He can't have it, so he'll destroy it. If he can't own the stream, he'll dam it, or poison it, or break the headwaters. Blame it on you. Start a panic." Maida set the tea down. She looked north toward the head of the San Virio, where the stream bubbled up from the high country springs. It was a half-mile walk in the dark. "I'll get the rope," she said. He nodded. "And the shovels. And one other thing." He went to his workbench. Tucked on a high shelf was a small, heavy box. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 damp, crumbling sticks of blasting powder. "Cora gave me this," he said. "It's spoiled. It was left in a wet shed. It won't shatter rock, but—" A grim, thin smile touched his lips. It will make a very loud noise. They did not walk the main path. They moved through the brush, two shadows, carrying their tools. The headwaters of the San Virio were a small, rocky pool contained by a natural ring of boulders, a crude, temporary dam of logs and packed earth, built by Maida's husband years ago, directed the flow into the main creek bed. If that dam were destroyed, the water would spill out, useless, across the open flats. Coulter chose his spot, a narrow game trail that led from the main track to the dam. He set the tripwire, a thin, dark cord, 6 inches off the ground. He buried the spoiled powder under a flat rock, attached his blasting cap, and ran the wire. He and Maida then retreated, not into the brush, but into a shallow, dry ditch 20 yards away, a natural trench that gave them a clear view of the dam. They lay flat on the cold, damp earth, and they waited. An hour passed. The cold began to seep into their bones. Maida's teeth chattered, and she pressed her lips together to silence them. Then the sound, not a charge, the careful, muffled clack of shod horses picking their way through rocks. 4 riders. They appeared against the skyline, dark shapes against the stars. Landon Price and the 3 gunmen who had fled the town hall. They dismounted, their movements quick, professional. They were not here to talk. "Get the bags," Price ordered, his voice a low, vicious hiss. 2 at the base, 1 on the spillway. I want this whole thing blown to hell. I want that witch to have nothing but mud. One of the gunmen, carrying a heavy canvas saddlebag, moved forward. He was the point man. He was moving fast, his eyes on the dam, not the ground. His boot caught the wire. The whoomp of the blast was not a sharp crack. It was a deep, concussive, deafening roar that shook the ground. A pillar of yellow, sulphurous smoke and pulverized dirt erupted, blotting out the stars. It was a vision of hell. The horses screamed. It was a sound of pure, animal terror. They reared, tore their reins from the hands of the man holding them, and bolted, disappearing into the darkness, a storm of pounding hooves. The 4 men were thrown flat. They were alive, but they were deafened, blinded, their ears ringing, their eyes streaming from the acrid smoke. "Ambush!" one of them shrieked, his voice thin with panic. Before the smoke had even begun to clear, Coulter moved. He was not a shadow. He was a force. A gunman struggled to his feet, pulling his pistol, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. Coulter hit him. Not with the rifle, with his shoulder. A full body tackle that made a sound like a heavy sack of grain hitting a stone floor. The man went down, his head striking a rock, and did not move. Just a heavy, sudden stillness. A second gunman was on his hands and knees, fumbling in the dark for the pistol he had dropped. He looked up, and Coulter was just there, a tall, silent shape standing over him. The man's nerve broke. He didn't even try to reach for the gun. He just raised his hands, his whole body trembling. The third gunman, the one who had been holding the horses, was already gone, running on foot into the darkness, crashing through the brush, fleeing the demon in the smoke. Landon Price was untouched. He had been thrown clear, and the smoke had shielded him. He scrambled to his feet, his mind catching up, his rage overriding his shock. He saw Maida. She was rising from the ditch, a shovel in her hand, her face dark with mud. "You!" he roared, his voice cracking. He lunged, not for a gun, but for her. He was fast. He slammed into her, expecting to knock her to the ground. He hit a wall. Maida had braced herself, her feet planted in the mud, held. Her solid, powerful body absorbed the impact. Price bounced off her, stumbling back, his arms windmilling. He was shocked. He had expected a soft victim, not an immovable object. He recovered, his face a mask of pure, reptilian hatred. He pulled his own pistol. "I'll kill you! You—" Maida was not holding the shovel. In the chaos, she had dropped it. She was holding the coil of rope. As Price raised his arm to aim, she threw. It was not a practiced, deft throw. It was a desperate, two-handed heave. The loop, heavy with mud, was not graceful. But it was true. It snagged, not on his neck, but on his wrist, trapping his gun hand. He fired, a convulsive shot that went wide, whistling into the night. Maida did not try to pull him. She did not have the leverage. She did the only thing she could. She anchored. She wrapped the free end of the rope, twice, around the heavy 6-inch thick marker post that stood at the edge of the dam, the post that measured the water's depth. She dug her heels into the sucking mud of the creek bank. She leaned back, putting all of her weight, all of her substance into the rope. Price was caught. He was tethered. He thrashed. He pulled. He swore. His pistol, still in his hand, waving uselessly. He was tied by his own gun hand to the very marker of the water he had come to destroy, and the widow was his anchor. Headlights. A shout. "What in God's name is that smoke?" Marshal Whit Rowan, with Deputy Rafe Coleman at his side, rode hard into the clearing, their rifles ready. The blast had been heard all the way to town. They skidded to a halt, taking in the scene. One man unconscious, one with his hands in the air, covered by Coulter, one fled, and Landon Price, screaming, tied to a post by a rope held by a mud-covered, exhausted, and triumphant Maida Hollis. "Well," Marshal Rowan said, lowering his rifle, his voice full of a kind of grim admiration. "You two have been busy." Rafe, all business, dismounted. He saw the heavy saddlebag the first gunman had dropped. He kicked it. It was heavy. He opened the flap and pulled out a stick of dynamite. It was real, with a fuse and cap. "Marshal," Rafe said, his voice quiet, holding up the stick. "They weren't here to dig a well. This is attempted sabotage, destruction of public resources." "Let me go!" Price was shrieking, his voice high and thin, still pulling against the rope. "You can't do this! You're nothing! You're just a fat widow! You're nothing!" Maida let the rope go slack. Price, his balance gone, fell backward into the mud. She was breathing hard, her hands raw from the hemp. She walked over, the mud sucking at her boots, and stood over him. She looked down at the man who had tormented her, the man who had tried to erase her. "I am heavy enough, Mr. Price," she said, her voice a low, cold thing, clear in the sudden quiet. "I am heavy enough to hold the water gate shut on your fate." Marshal Rowan nodded, his face like stone. He dismounted. "Cut him loose, Mrs. Hollis, Rafe. Put the cuffs on him. And on that one, too." He looked at the man Coulter was guarding. "Sabotage, conspiracy, attempted murder. The circuit judge in Santa Fe is going to be reading about this for a week." The next morning, Marshal Rowan stood on the steps of the now sealed Mesa Trust. He had the 3 prisoners, including Dorn, chained in a wagon, ready for the long ride to Santa Fe. He held a piece of paper, his own handwriting, the ink still fresh. He held it up. "By the authority of the New Mexico Territory," he announced, "this stream, the San Vireo, is hereby placed under temporary protective governance until the circuit judge can rule. Its administration is granted to a public committee, the Red Sage Water Committee." He looked into the small crowd, his eyes finding Maida. She was clean, wearing her last good dress, her bandaged hand at her side. "This committee needs a chair," Rowan said. "Someone who knows the water, someone who has sweat equity. I'm appointing Maida Hollis." He stepped down and handed her the paper. She took it. It was not a trophy. It was a heavy, terrifying responsibility. The town was cheering, but she just stared at the ink. Coulter came to stand beside her. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the stream, visible at the end of the street, glittering in the morning sun. "The marshal's right," Coulter said quietly, his voice just for her. Now the hard part begins. Building the flume, measuring the flow, starting the books. That night the town was truly, finally, at peace. Maida stood at the edge of the San Vireo, near Coulter's cabin. The air was cold, and the sky was a deep, velvet black, so full of stars it looked like spilled diamonds. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of running water. She knelt by the bank, at the very spot where she had tied Landon Price. She looked at the water, silver and black in the starlight, running free. She reached out with her bandaged hand and dipped her fingers into the current. It was achingly cold, and perfectly, beautifully real. She felt, rather than heard, Coulter come to stand beside her. He was a tall, solid shadow in the starlight. He didn't speak, he didn't touch her. He just stood, sharing the silence, his presence an anchor. They said nothing. No vows were exchanged. No promises were made. There was only the sound of the water, a quiet, constant, steady song of freedom. And there were two shadows, side by side, watching it flow. The work began before the ink on Marshal Rowan's order was fully dry. The first, most pressing task was not the flume, but the kitchen. Maida's old shack, the one of her widowhood, was too small, too full of ghosts. But next to Coulter's cabin, set against the same sheltering red rock, was a foundation of stone his own father had laid years ago, a project abandoned. It had a chimney. The cattlemen, led by Hatcher, came with wood. The prospectors, who had heard the story, came with shovels. The women, led by Alma, came with lye soap and scrub brushes. In 3 days, a new structure stood, a solid, wide room of pine and stone, the gaps chinked tight with mud and straw. Coulter, with the help of the town blacksmith, had built a new, massive oven, its face a wide arch of salvaged brick, while the mortar was still setting. Coulter took his knife. He pulled a thick, smooth plank of cured pine from his woodpile. He sat for an hour, the shavings curling at his feet. When he was done, he nailed the plank above the new oven, as a mantle, the first true centerpiece of the room. He had carved one word into it, the letters deep and sure: worth. Maida, her hands covered in flour, looked at it. She did not cry. She just nodded, a deep, slow acknowledgement. Then she slid the first dozen loaves of sourdough into the heat. She called it the Red Sage Kitchen. It was not a restaurant. It was not a charity. It was a hub. A sign was painted by Cora, her letters precise and beautiful: bread, soup, mint tea. Pay what you can, or work for what you need. And they did. Men, drifting in from the high country, their bellies empty, would find a steaming bowl of pinto bean soup waiting. They would eat, and then Maida would point to the head of the stream. "The committee needs 2 hours on the ditch. Mr. Reyes will show you where." They paid with sweat, a day's work on the flume, digging the channel Coulter had once only dreamed of, bought a week's worth of meals. The Red Sage Water Committee, with Maida at its head, was not just administering water. It was building the artery that would feed the entire basin, and she was feeding the men who built it. The town, fractured and suspicious, began to heal around this new center. Cora Lind, her official duties at the schoolhouse done by 3 o'clock, would move to the long plank table in Maida's kitchen. She'd set out her slates. Afternoon letters, she called it. She taught the ranchers' wives, who had never learned to sign their own names, how to read the labels on tins. She taught the young cowhands how to write letters home. Alma Finch, in turn, took over Maida's old shack. She whitewashed the walls, hung clean curtains, and opened a proper midwife's clinic. She was no longer just a shadow in the alleys. She was an institution. One afternoon, Alma came to the kitchen, not with a patient, but with a parcel. She unwrapped it on the table. It was a shawl, a great, heavy square of the finest wool, dyed a deep, vibrant crimson. "The color of the rock," Alma said, her voice soft. "The color of a fire in the hearth." Maida touched it. The wool was soft, but the stitching was what held her. Around the entire border, Alma had embroidered a running pattern, a thick, intricate design in a lighter red thread. "It's heather," Alma said, touching the stitching. "A highland plant. It grows where nothing else can. It's tough. It looks like a small, quiet fire. It reminded me of you." Maida could not speak. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders. It was the first beautiful thing, the first thing of color and softness she had owned in her life. The wedding was on a Tuesday. There was no announcement. It was simply time. Marshal Rowan had been delayed, his wagon breaking an axle on the way to Santa Fe. He returned to Juniper for the blacksmith and found himself, to his surprise, the guest of honor. There was no church, there was no pastor. They stood on the wide new porch of the kitchen in the late afternoon sun. The guests were Cora, Alma, Rafe Coleman, and Hatcher, the rancher. That was all. Maida wore her best dress, the simple wool one, and her new crimson shawl. Coulter wore his clean gray shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. Marshal Rowan, his hat in his hand, did not read from a book. He looked at them, his face serious. "Well," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I've seen a lot of things in this territory, but I've never seen two people who fit the land so tight. You were forged, both of you, and you earned this." He looked at Coulter. "Your vows." Coulter looked at Maida. He did not have flowery words. He had not prepared a speech. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple loop of thick copper wire, polished until it shone like gold. It was a wire from a fence he was mending. "I am a quiet man," he said, his voice rough. "The world, it was always loud, until I met you. You are the quiet, you are the rock, my hand." He held his hand out. She placed hers in it, her good hand, her palm unscarred. He slid the copper ring onto her finger. It was heavy, it was real. Rowan looked at Maida. She had no ring for him. She had something else. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. The new ledger, the first ledger of the Red Sage Water Committee. "I have no vows," she said, her voice clear and strong. I have an accounting. I was a person of debt. I was a person of nothing. And you..." She looked at Coulter, her eyes holding his. "You saw value. You saw worth. I have no ring to give you, but I have this." She opened the book. On the first page, in her neat, clear handwriting, was the first entry. San Vireo headwaters, flow rate measured, allocation Hatcher, 5 hours. Stevens, 5 hours. Common pasture, 10 hours. And at the top of the page, she had written 2 names, proprietors Maida Hollis Reyes, Coulter Reyes. She was giving him her name, and the water, and the work, all of it. Coulter looked at the book. He understood. He put his hand over hers, his fingers covering the page. "That'll do," he said. "Well, then," Marshal Rowan said, clearing his throat, his eyes suddenly misty. "By the authority of absolutely no one but myself, I pronounce you, well, you're married. You may kiss her, son." And Coulter did. Later, the guests were gone. The small celebration, a pot of rich stew, traded to the blacksmith for the copper wire, was over. A light, warm spring rain had begun to fall. A soft drumming on the new pine roof of the kitchen. The fire in the big oven was banked, but it threw a deep, soft, red glow across the room. A single candle burned on the table, its flame unwavering. They stood in the center of the room. The silence was thick, charged. It was not the silence of waiting, or of fear. It was the silence of arrival. Maida was acutely aware of her own body, as she always was. But, for the first time, it was not with shame. She was aware of the solid floor beneath her feet. She was aware of the heat from the oven on her back. She was aware of the man standing in front of her. He stepped closer. He did not reach for her. He simply was. "The rain is good," she said, her voice a whisper. "The stream will be high." "It's good," he agreed, his voice a low rumble. He raised his hand. Not to grab, not to pull. He raised it slowly, and his rough, calloused fingers, the ones that had dug splinters from her palm, gently touched her cheek. He traced the line of her jaw, a simple, exploratory touch. She leaned into it, closing her eyes, her breath catching. "Maida," he whispered, just her name. His other hand came up, settling on her shoulder, on the thick, soft wool of her new shawl. He drew her, not into a desperate, crushing embrace, but just closer, until the space between them was gone. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart through his shirt. She could feel the warmth of his body. She raised her own hands, resting them on his chest, feeling the muscle and bone beneath. He lowered his head. The kiss, their second, was nothing like the first. The first had been dust and desperation. This was water. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a promise. It was the taste of mint and wood smoke and a profound, quiet hunger. His lips were not demanding. They were a question. And she answered. She answered with the pressure of her own, with the small, soft sound that escaped her throat. His hands moved. They did not grasp. They learned. One hand slid from her shoulder, up into the thick, clean mass of her hair, his fingers tangling, holding her head as he deepened the kiss. His other hand moved from her shoulder, down her back, a simple, solid, reverent pressure that arched her into him. She felt his breath mingle with hers, warm, fast. She felt his heart hammering against her hands, a rhythm that matched her own. This was not a taking. It was a discovery. Every touch was an affirmation. Every shared breath was a word. You. The rain outside quickened. A steady, insistent drumming on the roof. A sound of life, of growth. The single candle on the table guttered as a draft found it, the flame dancing wildly for a moment. The last light, before it went out, showed only this ahead, resting on a broad chest, a hand, strong and dark, stroking a fall of unbound hair, and the sound of the rain, washing the world clean. The next morning, the sun was brilliant. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new leaves. They were at the stream, walking the bank. Coulter carried a bundle of wooden stakes. Maida carried the ledger. He was showing her his plan, the one from his notebook, the one for the flume. He paced it out, driving a stake into the soft mud at the new high water mark. "This is where the main channel goes," he said. As he hammered the stake, a spray of dark, rich mud splattered, catching the hem of Maida's skirt. She looked down at the mud. A week ago, she would have flushed, apologized, tried to scrub it off, ashamed of the stain. Coulter saw her looking. He froze, waiting for the apology. Maida looked at the mud. She looked at the running water. She looked at the man she had married. A slow, deep, genuine laugh bubbled up from her chest. It was a sound he had never heard. It was full and rich and free. Coulter stared at her, a slow, wide grin, a thing of pure, unpracticed beauty, spread across his own face. He laughed with her. She didn't apologize for the mud. She didn't apologize for her laugh. She didn't apologize for the space she took up. The work continued. The ranchers, seeing Coulter's grin, came with their horses and logging chains, pulling timber for the flume. The prospectors, hearing Maida's laugh, brought their shovels. The Red Sage Water Committee, now officially chartered, began to fill its ledger. The first page was already done. Maida, her ring a bright copper circle on her finger, turned to the second. One day, a figure appeared, standing at the edge of the work. Pastor Obadiah Kelt. He was thinner, his suit worn. The town had not been kind. He came to Maida, his hat in his hand. Mrs. Reyes, I have sinned. I was wrong. I humbly beg your forgiveness. Maida looked at him. She looked at the men working. She looked at Coulter. Before she could speak, Cora Lind, who was on her way to the afternoon lessons, stopped. She looked Kelt up and down. Forgiveness is the Lord's pastor, Cora said, her voice sharp as glass. Your penance, however, is with the town. Go home, relearn your letters, relearn your scripture. Read the parts about humility, not just the parts about burdens. And when you've done that, then perhaps you can preach. Kelt, his face pale, said nothing. He just nodded and walked away. A small bridge was built, connecting the kitchen to the main road, and next to it, a small, three-sided shed. The Red Sage Tea House. It was just a counter and a kettle, but the steam, smelling of sweet, wild mint, drew travelers from the main road. At night, when the work was done and the books were closed, Coulter would sit on the porch of the kitchen, his back against a post. He would pull a worn, battered guitar from a case she had never seen. He would play. He was not a master. He just played. Simple, quiet, wandering melodies that seemed to follow the sound of the running stream. Maida would sit on the step below him, her head resting against his knee, her crimson shawl around her shoulders. She would listen, the music and the water and the quiet of the night blending into one. He finished a song, the last note hanging in the cool air. He set the guitar aside. He reached down, and she looked up. He moved, sliding down to sit on the step beside her. He didn't say anything. He just put his arm around her, pulling her close, until her head rested in the familiar, perfect space on his shoulder. He pressed his forehead to her temple, his skin warm. "The fire," he said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "The one I was always chasing, in the canyons, in the storms. It's done running." He kissed the top of her head. "This fire," he whispered, "has found its hearth." The summer came, not as a gentle relief, but as a hot-breathed adversary. The sky turned a hard, pale blue, bleached by a sun that refused to yield. The drought, the one the old-timers had feared, settled on the New Mexico territory. The land cracked. The creeks that fed the big cattle ranches to the north dried to ribbons of dust and white, alkaline-crusted stones. But in the Red Sage Basin, a miracle was happening. While the rest of the land withered, the San Vireo stream ran full and steady. The new flume, a long, raw pine artery built by Coulter's hand and Maida's will, was a dark, wet line of life. It did not leak. It did not fail. It carried the water, cool and clear, from the headwaters to the common fields. And in those fields, Hatcher's bean plants, which should have been brown, skeletal sticks, were a vibrant, shocking green. They were flowering. Maida's kitchen became a fixture. It was no longer just a room. It was the heart of the basin. Its reputation spread down the trade routes. Freight wagons, which had once bypassed Juniper Crossing, now made it a mandatory stop. The drivers, their faces like cracked leather, would climb down from their wagons, not heading for the saloon, but for the stone building by the bridge. "Stop at Maida's." The word went, "The bread is heavy and the water is free." They ate thick slices of sourdough, dipped in bowls of pinto bean soup, and they paid. Some paid with coin. Others, their pockets empty, paid with an afternoon of labor, strengthening the dam, clearing rocks from the irrigation ditch, or splitting wood for Maida's massive oven. The kitchen was not a charity. It was a system. It ran on work. Word came back from Santa Fe, carried by Marshal Rowan himself on his next circuit. The trial was over. Eamon Ridley and Lyle Dorn, faced with their own ledger and the testimony of a federal marshal, were found guilty on all counts. They were not, however, sent to prison. The territorial judge was a practical man who saw no profit in feeding broken men. Instead, he delivered a suspended sentence, binding them to one single crippling condition: full financial restitution. The Mesa Trust Bank, under new, unimpressed ownership from a firm in the East, was forced to liquidate its assets to pay a ruinous sum into the newly chartered Red Sage Water Committee Community Fund. Ridley was ruined, left with nothing but the suit he stood in. Dorn was stripped of his title and barred from public office for life. And Landon Price, he was tried in absentia, declared an outlaw, a warrant for his arrest and a $500 bounty on his head. But he had vanished, swallowed by the high desert. He became just another ghost story told over a dying fire. The story of the trial, the story of the fight, settled into the land. It became a local legend, a tale told to children. They didn't talk about the ledgers. They talked about the stand. They told of a quiet, lone cowboy, a man who was, as the story went, light enough to place his heart in a good woman's hands. And they told of the widow who had been heavy enough to hold the water, heavy enough to anchor the law, heavy enough to keep the gates shut on the devil's own fate. The insult had been reforged. It was now a title of honor. Maida sat on the porch in the late afternoon, the ledger open on her lap. It was not a book of debt. It was a book of life. She was reading the ditch rider schedule for the week. Monday. She read aloud, her voice calm in the quiet air. Hatcher's eldest son. Tuesday, the blacksmith. Wednesday, Mrs. Stevens. Thursday, Mr. Dow. Mr. Dow, the quiet, precise Chinese man who had opened a new laundry in town, had requested his share. He did not need it for crops. He needed it for his vats, to wash the grime from the rancher's clothes. He paid his share, in labor, with the others. Sweat for water. Maida had written on the first page the committee's new motto, water for bread. The sun finally dipped below the high red rocks, and the world was plunged into a deep, profound purple. The heat of the day fled, replaced by the cool, clean air of the high desert. In the basin, by the new wooden bridge, a new sound was heard, the sound of children's laughter. They were Hatcher's kids and Stevens's. They were skipping rocks in the clear, shallow water of the overflow channel, their calls echoing in the twilight. On the other side of the bridge, the schoolhouse was dark, but Cora Lind had left her lesson on the chalkboard, angled by the door for all to see. It was not arithmetic. It was not history. It was one word, written in large, perfect block letters. Freedom. Coulter walked up from the lean-to. The evening chores were done. The mare was fed, and Maida's goats, now a loud and permanent fixture, were secure in their pen. He stopped at the heavy iron cistern pump. He worked the handle, the squeak thud a comforting rhythm. He splashed the cold stream water over his head, washing away the dust of the day. He scrubbed his face and hands, the water dripping from his beard, and dried himself on a clean cloth hanging from a peg. He walked onto the porch, his movement slow, his body tired in the good way a working man is tired. Maida was there. She had set the ledger aside. She was holding 2 tin cups, steam rising from them in the cool air, the sharp, sweet scent of wild mint. He took one. He did not speak. He just looked at her. He raised his cup in a silent toast. She raised hers. The cups touched, a small, quiet tink. They drank. He set his cup down on the porch rail. He looked at her, at the way the purple light softened the lines of her face, at the way her hair, now streaked with a few strands of silver, was pinned loosely at her neck. He reached out, his hand sliding behind her head, his fingers strong and warm at her nape. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He drew her closer. The kiss was not the desperate, dusty kiss of the hayshed. It was not the formal, public kiss of their wedding. This was the kiss of a Tuesday. It was the kiss of home. It was soft and sure and long. It was a conversation without words, a restatement of fact. It tasted of mint and wood smoke, and a deep, settled peace. She pulled back, but only an inch, resting her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her, enfolding her. His chin rested on the top of her head. The wind, rising as the desert cooled, shifted. It came down from the high canyons, and it carried the one true perfume of the basin, the sharp, clean, resinous scent of wild sage. And beneath the sound of the wind, there was the other sound, the constant sound, the music of the stream. It ran over the rocks, under the bridge, through the flume. It was a sound so steady, so present. It was no longer just water. It was a hymn, a quiet, wordless anthem of persistence. A month later, a traveler, a man worn thin by the trail, his horse limping, rode into Juniper Crossing. He was tired. He was thirsty. He had been overlooked by every foreman from here to the border. He stopped his horse at the bridge, looking for the saloon. He saw the tea house first, a small, welcoming shed, and next to it, nailed to the main post of the bridge, a large, new, freshly painted sign. The words were clear, the letters simple. "If you are tired, sit. If you—" He dismounted and walked closer, his boots kicking up dust. "If you are thirsty, drink. If you have been overlooked, stay." He stood there for a long time, reading the words over and over. A woman, her face kind, her body strong, came out onto the porch of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She wore a bright crimson shawl. She saw him. She did not look away. She did not judge his worn clothes or his thin horse. "Evening," she called, her voice clear. "Pot's on. You look like you could use some soup." The view pulls back. It leaves the traveler walking toward the kitchen, toward the light. It drifts away from the porch, from the woman, from the man who has just come to stand behind her, his hand on her shoulder. It sweeps up over the new red-shingled roof of the kitchen, a plume of clean wood smoke rising from the chimney. It follows the line of the stream, a ribbon of pure silver in the twilight, as it runs through the green, breathing fields. It comes to rest, for one last moment, on Maida's face. She is looking at the traveler, a smile on her lips. It is not the pained, tight smile of her past. It is the open, confident, radiant smile of a woman who is no longer silent, a woman who has found her worth. The echo remains, settling into the red rocks, carried on the sage-scented wind. Not everyone marries a fat widow, but in the red sage basin, the people learn to value, above all else, a person who could work and a person who could love, as if the whole, wide, terrible desert had decided, finally, to burst into bloom. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment down below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by even more people.